If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
Woods enthusiasts, campers, and hikers, share your scariest encounters with the unknown, strange creatures, or paranormal beings in the deep woods and forests.
On a hunt, I encountered something in the woods. I thought it was a person in a blue coat. I approached, and something didn't feel right. Despite having a 7mm Magnum and the ability to take down any animal in Washington, something felt off. This thing made me back away slowly in fear. It darted in and out, peeking. Then moved 7 feet up and peeked. It was solid, then shimmered. I tripped over an old hobo camp. Rifle was at the ready. I backed away, very scared. I made it to my buddy's truck, which was 200 feet away. I seriously walked backwards, keeping my eye on it. My buddy shows up. He's pale as a ghost. I didn't see anything, he said. I didn't even ask, and he was scared and on the verge of tears. We left without saying what we saw. I was camping with a few people west of Tupper Lake. A friend and I were sitting out at the edge of a small lake watching the stars. After a while, we both were completely frozen and overcome with a sense of fear/dread. The feeling could generally be localized to a place across the lake. It was a bit like the feeling when someone behind you is staring at you, but with absolute hatred/malevolence. And yet at the same time it was almost like the stars and shoreline across the lake were erased. You couldn't really sense that spot. The feeling of foreboding was enough to freeze us in place for several moments. After a while we decided to get out of there and head back to the safety of camp and the fire. As we neared camp, we ran into 2 friends who had been on a night hike toward that side of the lake. Both were freaked out and nearly in tears and had run back to camp themselves, having had a similar, and if anything more terrifying experience. I'm being stalked. I don't know what it is. I've lived in the same house for the last 18 years, and it's only gotten worse. I live in an old coal mining town in Pennsylvania. I know my house is haunted, but I believe that to be beside the point. Something is stalking my family. The first encounter I had was in the early 2010s. I heard my name being called repeatedly from far away, and it sounded like my friend. Started walking towards home and turned because I felt I was being watched. I saw a dark, humanoid figure that was at least 7 to 8 feet tall. I ran home. Things were fairly quiet as far as I can remember up until the last few years. Recently, things have been amping up. It started as rustling in the woods and the feeling of being watched. Next came the deer. So many deer. There was one I recall seeing multiple times in the same spot for a few days on my way home that just didn't look right. The most recent encounter has left me researching what to do. 2 nights ago my mom saw a pale white face with glowing eyes pressed up against the front door. She said she froze in fear and didn't know what to do. Tonight I got home after dark and walked toward my house. Seconds after I locked my car, I heard a blood-curdling scream come from the train tracks, followed by a quiet voice yelling, "Help me!" very loudly. I froze in fear for a solid 15 seconds just listening. I slowly walked up my porch steps, just listening to 2 different voices screaming, one frantic and screeching while the other was calm and just called out, "Help me!" I yelled in the front door for my mom because the frantic voice sounded vaguely like my youngest sister, but I thought maybe she was messing around. When she came outside, it grew quiet, and the frantic voice had stopped. We heard "Help me" 1 or 2 more times faintly, then nothing. My sister was at a friend's house, and it wasn't hers. We went to pick up dinner, and there were deer everywhere. Now, this isn't uncommon for PA to see a ton of deer, but like I said before, these ones were weird. They stared right at you and didn't run from the car, even if they were in the middle of the road. Someone please tell me what the duck is going on. What are these things? Huge red-eyed being in the woods. Location date, Northern Virginia, January 2001, 3 a.m. Several family members living in a remote location heard strange screams or yells coming from the woods resembling that of a woman crying out in pain. Terrified, they called the police and went out to investigate. The police searched the area with high-powered lights but could not find anything. Some time later they heard the screams again, and again the police were summoned, and again nothing was found. Next time they decided not to call the police again. Days later the dogs were heard barking in the backyard. A female witness points the flashlight out back and sees 2 huge red eyes looking back at her. She focuses the light on the eyes but can't make out the figure. She yelled out for additional family members, but the eyes disappeared. She vaguely sees a dark figure run into the woods. A couple of months later, the Maine witness was strolling near the horse trailer when he saw a huge figure with gray wiry fur and black patches. The terrified witness froze in place and fixed the flashlight on the creature, which moved behind the trailer and vanished. Days later, neighbors saw a similar creature in their backyard. I got hunted by a Wendigo, maybe, I don't know what it was. This was a few years ago, so I, 13 meters, and my cousin, 15 meters, were in my grandma's backyard having a fire. We had some family over, but they all left around 10 p.m. except my cousin, so it was just me and him back there with only the light from the fire. Around 1 a.m. we heard a screech come from far back in the woods, sounding about a mile away. We thought it was just an animal being killed or something. Then we heard another screech, closer this time. We still shrugged it off as an animal. But then we heard a third screech closely followed by my name, not gonna say my real name, Sean, being said in a female voice. It sounded like my aunt, and at this point we were scared but stayed because we weren't allowed inside because of COVID. So we stayed, and we kept hearing footsteps in the woods, cracking branches, etc. We hear another screech, and it's at the forest line. At this point, we're freaking out. Then everything went silent for about 2 minutes. We just sat there scared out of our minds, and then just out of the light of the fire, we heard big branches snap from our wood pile, and to our horror, we heard Sean's name 10 feet away from us, and we saw a 10-foot tall skinny white creature with no face. We saw that, and it was instant fight or flight. We ran as fast as we could inside. I don't think it chased us. We got in the house safe. I didn't care about COVID at that point, but now I never go in the woods by myself, even with people. It feels like I'm being watched/followed. Thanks so much for listening to the end of my story. If someone could give a possible explanation or tell me what was hunting me, that would be greatly appreciated. Loxley Woods is on the A39, near Street, Somerset. When you drive through at night, it is totally spooky. There have been accidents there for decades. I remember once there was a Cortina wedged sideways between two trees that were just a couple feet apart. People say they crashed to avoid people in the road, but that area is empty at night. Then there's the fabled apparition of Pockok the highwayman, who gallops on his horse without any forward motion. There is an ancient track that joins the marshlands on each side of the hills that could be Bronze Age or earlier. I can't think of a wood I'd least like to walk through at night. Moose River Plains, sleepless night, creature. I just wanted to see if anyone else has had an issue while camping in Moose River Plains. I went camping in a remote site and basically had an animal that was hanging out just behind the thick brush surrounding the camp. It hung around and made loud thump noises, 3 loud thump noises at a time, thump thump thump. It stayed within 20 to 25 feet of the camp from about 10 p.m. until about 5 a.m. 3 times throughout the night. It sprinted in front of the tent. We were inside lying down. We had a rock the size of a softball tossed against the tent and had a log about a foot long and 4 inches around, a piece of our firewood, tossed at the tent. It came wishing feet of us about 10:30 p.m. while we were sitting at the fire. I got up to grab a bag of peanuts from the chuck box, and it ran back in the thick brush. It wasn't a small animal because of how loud the thumps were. It couldn't have been any scavenger because nothing was disturbed at camp, even the trash bag full of 2 days of camping trash wasn't touched. When it ran away from us when I stood up, it only took a few steps back and stopped. I feel like it watched us and teased us all night long. I've camped literally hundreds of times and have had many experiences with various animals. I'm headed back up this weekend with some inferred deer cams and recorders to see if it'll come back. Has anyone else had a similar experience in Moose River Plains? Or does anyone know of a large animal that could make loud noises, like a 15-pound rock being pounded on the ground, and would hang out for 6 to 8 hours without leaving? I'm stumped and confused. Any insight would be nice. Thank you. During a walking holiday in Lancashire from Blackburn to Skipton, we became somewhat lost. We assumed we were somewhere near Barrow based on how far we'd walked. Anyway, we managed to find a lovely B&B for the night in a pub just down the country lane, although it was quicker to go through the woods. The weather was fine during the day. At night? Ducking terrifying. I'm surprised I didn't shit myself. As we were walking through the night, we heard an owl hooting, and we instinctively ran back to the B&B. Anyway, the next day, in the daytime, we bought a map of where we actually were. Know where we were? Ducking Pendleton. As in the Pendle witch trials. We probably escaped witches or something. I am looking for information on something encountered. This happened in Canada, British Columbia, and Smithers. I can't exactly remember the year, but it was between 2019 and 2023. I was walking up to the camper. We lived right beside the woods on the outskirts of town, and as I glanced to my side, immediately as I locked eyes with it, dread hit me like a ton of bricks, and I screamed, immediately turning away. Something was crouching under the lifted part of the camper. After I turned away, I felt something touch my back and barely saw a blur run into the bush. My partner said whatever it was he saw, it was roughly 13 feet tall with gray-looking skin. Any ideas on what this thing was? I wanted to explain an encounter with something. I'm not quite sure what it was. I had gotten into an argument with my mom about the hat man that was leaning over me while I slept on the couch, something my sister informed me of the following day. A lot of weird stuff happened at that house. But that wasn't the encounter. No, it was after the argument. I was walking out of the house down the road, which we were surrounded by woods, and a small swamp was behind our place. I was walking down the road, which was side by side with a wooded area. Not many people came down where we were. So I was listening to music while on my walk, and I felt like something was watching me. I lived in Alabama, so it was weird. Nobody came in our woods. Not ever. I looked over, and there I saw it. It was hunched over and huge. It had pale features and was so skinny I could see its ribcage. The thing that took me off was its mask-like face. It didn't wear a mask, but its face had mask-like features. The only reason why I say its face wasn't wearing a mask was because I could see its mouth perfectly. It had dark eyes. I thought it had eye bags, but maybe it was because I was trying to reassure myself. I heard a branch crunch under its hands. I like to assure myself they were at least. It reminded me of a human, but all wrong. Please, someone tell me they've got some explanation because I can't. Something followed my friend and me through the woods. So this happened years ago, while I was still in high school. I'm now 23 and have never shared this story anywhere, and only ever with a select few in person. I live in Missouri, just north of Kansas City. One night my buddy and I snuck out of my parents' house to go smoke. There was a trail that was right by my house and a local elementary school. Never really seen anything out there outside of deer, foxes, coyotes, etc., but growing up we heard from parents and other families that the woods nearby were haunted. The area we lived in was right near an old slave farm, and I never gave it much thought. Being a kid who, yes, believes in Bigfoot but has never seen any true proof, so I'm still pretty skeptical of stories. Anyways, back to my story. After we snuck out, we made it to the trail. On one side of it there was the back of a house, and on the other side, woods. As we were walking down the trail, it felt like any other time we had done it. For the first 3/4s of the trail, everything was fine, but as we came up to the final bend, my friend slapped my arm and pointed into the woods and asked if I had just seen that. I looked into the woods and saw nothing, so I blew it off and thought he was just out of it. So I kept walking like everything was fine while he still had his eyes glued to the woods. At the final stretch, about 50 yards, all canopied over, he slapped my arm again and stopped me. This time with force, so I looked over, thinking it was still nothing. I saw a figure of something similar to a human shape but standing about 8 feet high. The reason I saw it was that the trees by it were shaking. At this point I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was scared nonetheless. I said that we should keep moving, and we did, but now I too had my eyes glued on whatever it was in the woods. We picked up our pace to a speed walk, and after about 10 steps or so, the thing started to move as well, but on a path that would put it on the trail in front of us before the end. At that point we looked at each other and immediately started running, like running as fast as we could. We made it to the end of the trail and cut up through someone's yard and into the street. Once there, I looked back towards the trail and saw that figure standing on the edge of the trail. After that we went back to mine and talked about what just happened. Like I said, this is the first time I've ever shared it anywhere. Also, there haven't been any bear sightings up by my area, but we have had some bobcats and cougars. Not sure what it was. I don't think it was a Bigfoot, but if it was human, then it had to be some 8 feet tall guy in the woods behind my neighborhood at 2 a.m. My life-threatening encounter. I was camping with my dad in the middle of the woods in Washington. At about 3 in the morning we heard loud howling from several beings. I have heard wolves and coyotes in these woods, and this was nothing like that. The next day we went looking for prints from these animals, but the only thing that was different was a ring of non-rectangular trees with huge marks inside the circle. Now, a member in Washington state has the largest amount of Bigfoot sightings a year. It was terrifying. We decided to leave, and as we were driving away, several large logs came rolling down the street. We managed to drive around them. It was a really old logging road, so when we went to the side of the road, we got stuck in mid. Rocks. Started raining down from the sky. We managed to get out of the mud and drive away. As I looked behind me, I saw several mad, large, furry beings. It was either Bigfoot or a furry cult. I do not know which is more terrifying. I got one story. I don't know if it qualifies or not, but it definitely qualifies as spooky. I was living in eastern Kentucky, growing up on a haunted hill. Beside the neighborhood, there is a dirt road. There are gas wells out there, and this is where we drove our dirt bikes, four-wheelers, and everything like that. No one ever walks over there, but since I didn't have any gas for my dirt bike that day, I decided to walk there instead. I'm approximately 15 years old, in my first year of high school, and I'm walking back. I have my machete by my side, scanning the area for snakes and deer. As I'm looking around, I suddenly notice two men standing ahead. And this is a straight stretch of, I would say, 200 or 300 yards, and suddenly, they are 20 feet in front of me. So I tell them, "You scared the you-know-what out of me." And one of the men says, "Well, I'm sorry." They approach me and ask questions such as, "How did you get out here?" And I told him, "Well, I just live half a mile from here." And they said they were very confused and then said, "How did you get past the gates?" And, well, I told them, "There is no gate. There used to be a gate there, but it had been ripped out a couple of years ago. Keep in mind, this is the only entrance for miles. This road runs for miles and miles. And a few miles the other way, there's another entrance, and it doesn't have a gate either." So, that's a really weird question, and the direction they were coming from was the direction of my house, and there's only one way in and only one way out. And I'm thinking, they should know there's no gate there. So, anyway, this whole time I'm talking to them, I'm getting really creeped out, really freaked out. They are staring directly at my eyes, and they are not looking anywhere I'm motioning. I'm motioning at my house. I say, "I'm out here with my machete, I'm looking for snakes." They focus solely on my eyes, not on my machete. Only one of the men is talking to me, but both are looking directly into my eyes. Anyway, so I'm freaked out. I'm thinking, where am I going to go? I never really see anybody out there unless they are riding a motorcycle, a dirt bike, or a four-wheeler. So I start walking back towards my house. We crossed paths. Of course, I'm scared and nervous, and within a few feet, I take a few steps, and I turn around, and they are not there. They are gone. That gate hadn't been there in a couple of years, and I don't really know what that was about, but I start walking fast. I'm really nervous now. My heart's racing. I'm panting. I'm walking fast, and I turn back, and they are still not there. There's nowhere for them to hide, but they are still not there, so I'm convinced something bad's about to happen. I'm running back to my house. I reach the road again, and there's not a work truck there, there's nothing there, so I make it home. I slam the door and lock it. I talked to my mom and told her, "Somebody's trying to kill me, two men are trying to kill me." I sat there in the house, terrified, for the rest of the day. So my buddy in Alaska had a story for me. He said he was walking with his buddy at around 2 to 3 a.m. past the Palmer Fairgrounds last winter. When his buddy grabbed him and pointed across the road from them and said, "Look at that." Across the road from them was what at first looked to him like a moose. It had a long snout, and his friend said he saw antlers. When it stood up on its hind legs, he said it was a couple feet taller than him from what he could see, and he's 6 tall. When it stood up, he took off running, and his buddy yelled and started running after him, and as they were running, he said it was running alongside them on the other side of the road. He said it sounded like a man running, bipedal, and its footsteps were extremely heavy, sounding like heavy thuds as it was running alongside them. After a couple of seconds of running, he said his buddy whipped around and said, "F this, let's fight it," and they started pumping each other up, and they picked up their skateboards to use to attack it. But when they turned to try and find it, there was nothing there, and it had disappeared. They combed all over that area that they were in but never saw it again. When they got home, they both had the exact same story and both said they saw the exact same thing. So just curious what y'all think and if there's anyone in this area or just in Alaska in general who has similar stories or experiences. Something in the woods tonight. I figured I'd share this here to get some thoughts after I've terrified my wife. I want to preface this by saying that I have hunted and hiked in the region since I was 9 years old. I am very familiar with the wildlife and the sounds of the forest. It's not like I believe in anything, but I don't know what happened tonight. I hiked about 1.5 miles through forest and swamp hunting deer today and got to the pocket of woods and field that I wanted to be in and climbed a tree to hunt out of. By all accounts, this was an uneventful afternoon and evening until sundown. For about 30 straight minutes, I listened to a rabbit being tortured and just wouldn't die. If you've heard a dog or hawk get a rabbit or hunted rabbits, you know what I am talking about. When they are distressed, they scream bloody murder. And this just seemed to continue forever. Naturally, this can make you on edge, but I figured a hawk got it and just wasn't killing it. Then the sound of a twig snapping and silence, the rabbit stopped. Through the thicket, I could make out a figure, vaguely deer-shaped, moving through the woods about 35 yards away, So I grabbed my bow, but the undergrowth is far too thick for me to pick out much more than a rough outline. It walked behind a tree and disappeared. Now that the sun has fully set, I find myself in the final 15 minutes of post-sundown light. From where the deer vanished, I hear a flat, emotionless child's voice saying, "Help! Help! Help!" Without any fluctuation or distress, just a simple statement. Help! 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 It said that probably 15 times, and then the woods went silent. There wasn't even a breeze to make a sound. Then a crack of a limb of a tree snapping, and all hell broke loose in the woods. Squirrels, birds, and deer suddenly shot out of this woods like bats out of hell, sounding like an absolute stampede through the forest. And then silence again. To make things worse for me, I lost my hat clip light on my walk in and had to haul ass a mile and a half through the woods back to my truck in darkness, my path only lit by tonight's full moon. Something found me in Maine. Back in 2010 I was driving around looking for a place to bird hunt. I finally stopped at a piece of town-owned property that I had only gone on once before, and that was to fish for trout in a brook that crossed about a mile in. After parking, I started down an old tote road that split the property for its entire length. The day was very nice, and nothing seemed unusual. I followed the road until I got to the far side of an old wood yard that abutted the stream. That's when it just got quiet. The opening was probably 20 yards across, with the brook hidden behind some alders on the other side. I sensed it before I heard it. Something told me not to go across the clearing to the stream. I have spent a lifetime in the woods, and I have only had that feeling a few times. The first sound that I heard was heavy steps, very deliberate and slow. I couldn't see what was making that sound, and for no reason I felt fear. I knew that I did not want to see what was approaching me. It stopped at the brook, and I heard it cross and walk to the edge of the alders, then stop. All that I had was a single-shot 20 gauge with birdshot. I had a feeling of danger. It moved on the inside of the alders to my left a few yards at a time. The only glimpse that I caught was a dark, narrow figure, very tall, as in at least 7 feet. Not knowing what else to do, I pointed my shotgun in the air and touched off a shot. It just stayed where it was. I shouted. It did not move. That little voice told me to go, don't run, but go. As I backed up, the elders, where I last heard it, moved and parted as if it was getting a better look, but whatever it was stayed right there as if to let me know it saw me and to go no further. That mile walk back to my truck felt as if I was walking through a cemetery at night, always turning around and looking everywhere. This encounter has played over and over in my mind. I don't know what that was. I have never gone back only because something inside of me is saying it would not end well. 14 years later, and it still scares me. Anyways, that's my encounter, and I've never told anyone until now. Strange deer encounter? I just recently remembered this story from when I was quite young, so I figured I could share it here as, looking back, it's kinda creepy. I grew up in the Midwest, a little north of Chicago. When I was probably around 12, a friend and I saw some deer behind his house. There was a large field behind it that a forest bordered, so it wasn't uncommon for deer to be there. Being kids, we wanted to go pet the deer, so we slowly approached them. We walked across the field to them so we wouldn't spook them. Looking back, the deer should have run. 2 big creatures walking towards a herd of deer should have spooked them, but they all just kept on eating the grass. I was in front of my friend, so I got a closer look at the deer than he did. I was maybe about 6 feet away from this deer when it finally looked up at me. I noticed her knees and saw that they were bloodied. I just figured it was because she had previously laid down on them or something and got scratched up. I looked up at her face, and I was filled with fear, something that was very unlike me as a child, and so we ran. Now remembering this later, something I did not think about at the time as strange was the fact her knees were facing the wrong way. Not like they were broken, but like they had grown to be the wrong way. Of course, she could have had a defect or something like that, but everything combined with the feeling of dread I felt looking into her eyes creeps me out years later. If anyone has any thoughts on this, please share. We are being hunted. A little backstory, I've always had weird experiences, be it ghosts or strange animals. It just always seems to follow me and my family. We had just recently moved into an old farmhouse just off the main road. The house comes with 88 acres of land, and only 4 people live on or near it, including us. When we first moved in, nothing abnormal happened. It was just a small, out-of-the-way house that seemed like a new start for us all. After a month of us living here, we started hearing strange noises outside at night, but nothing too serious. One night we decided to have a fire and get drunk. Well, I and a few other guys that were there that night decided to do some night fishing. While fishing in the pond that was maybe a mile into the woods, we started hearing screaming. We just think that it is one of the girls back at the house, so we head back, but on our way back we start noticing that there are no more sounds. No sounds of nature, no birds, no crickets. Nothing, so we stop to listen. As we do this, we hear the sounds of chains rushing towards us. As it gets maybe 15 feet from us, I point a gun at where I think the sound stopped and fire a shot at the ground a couple of inches from it. After a minute passes, the chains rush to the house. Nothing happened after that until we all go inside and start going to bed. We all hear a female scream again, but behind it there was a deep, distorted laugh. After that, nothing happened until 3 weeks later, when my dad and I went fishing out at the pond late in the afternoon. As it inches closer to dusk, we notice 3 pale white animals on the opposite side of the pond, but as soon as we notice the animals, they run, but instead of running on all fours like a normal animal, they all jump up to their hind legs and jump 8 feet into a tree and hop from tree to tree away. As we see this, we decide to head back home, but on the way back we hear the trees start rustling, and it keeps getting closer and closer until we get to the house and lock the doors. I decide to set up cams in the woods and around the house. At first, I don't get anything, just deer and wolves. Until one night, a cam close to the house is moved for an hour and then moved back. Nothing really came of that until one night. After a long day of working, I decide to play a video game with a few friends. At about 11 at night, I hear 2 taps, but I ignore it thinking it was on the game. It continues till 2 in the morning. Periodically, every 5 minutes, 2 consecutive taps would happen. I finally took my headphones off and heard it at my window, and when I looked, I saw orange eyes 7 feet off the ground. After 2 minutes of staring at each other, they moved closer to the window and smiled at me with blood-stained daggers for teeth. Its face looked like a pale, wolf-like one, with some decay along the sides of its head and neck. After doing this, it backs away and leaves. Now every night something happens, like tonight, as I'm writing this, it rushed onto the porch and clawed the door. As it's doing this, it is bellowing out a laugh that almost sounds like a deranged madman crossed with a hyena. Tomorrow, I and a few guys are going into the woods with guns to try and finally put an end to this torment. Blue being in the woods. This happened in the summer of 2016. I was at a big bonfire gathering at a place called the Desert, a large wooded area with the Missouri River running through it and sandy riverbeds all over the place. There's a big, crazy, complex path that goes through this wooded area, and all these dirt bikes and stuff fly all over there all the time. Anyway, it was probably 11 p.m. and dark out, and I had gone to my car to grab a smoke and decided to take a leak while I was away from the friends. Oh, I also want to mention I wasn't under the influence of anything, as I had been asked to DD that night, which makes this encounter all that more bizarre, lol, so I was taking a piss and heard my name called from this real dark area of those woods. I called out, "Yo, I'm pissing. What do you want?" No reply, so I shrug my shoulders and finish up. Then hear my name called again, only from a far opposite side of the wooded area. So I holler again, no response. I start walking into the woods, on the dirt bike path, thinking someone's screwing with me. And thought I saw something a baby blue color moving among the trees? So I stop and hear my name called, or I should say whispered, from all around. Oddly enough, I had no fear and kept walking forward toward the light thing I'd seen. I'm quite a way into the woods, as I can no longer see the bonfire, and it was a huge fire, and I start seeing that blue thing again as it stepped out from behind a tree, and it paused long enough for me to make out what it was. It's a glowing figure, very skinny and probably 8 feet tall, the most beautiful blue I've ever seen. Now, most people would have turned tail and run like the wind, but this thing emitted some kind of mesmerizing love vibe in which, looking back on it, I felt pulled to it and felt like I went into a trance-like state. So I kept walking towards this thing and actually picked up my speed because in my mind I'm thinking, I gotta get to this figure because I wanna hug it. Like why was I thinking this is beyond me? The feeling I had running through my mind was so backwards I can't even describe it really. Almost, had to be their type of feeling that went along with this. Anyway, I'm probably like 100 feet from this thing, and I can see details in it, such as definitions on its face, and I can see that it has 3 fingers, which at the time didn't scare me one bit, so I'm standing and looking at this thing, and I start jogging towards it, yep, jogging, lamau. I then suddenly stop on a dime, metaphorically speaking, and the thought, like, slams into my mind, Shane, if you take one more step toward this thing, no one will ever see you again. You'll be another statistic of people that go missing in the woods. Going from an almost elated love state to sheer fear is an odd sensation. Anyway, I started backing up slowly, and this being actually started taking steps toward me. Well, hell, I thought this thing was gonna come running after me, So I cruised like a marathon runner and started screaming my friends' names the second that the bonfire came back into view through the trees. I'm very lucky that the path I had chosen to take was a straight shot from where I started, because the rate at which I was willing to follow this thing could easily have drawn me into taking all kinds of pathways and gotten me quite lost in this huge wooded area of crisscrossy dirt bike tracks. When I got back to the bonfire, I told everyone what happened. A few went into the area with flashlights looking for this blue being, but to no avail. Apparently, I'd been gone over an hour? Seriously, it seemed like 20 minutes. Anyway, there is some kind of entity or entities that dwell in the woods of Kimball Bottoms, aka the desert in Bismarck, North Dakota. I'm a bit north of y'all in Kentucky, and I don't have a story personally. But I've heard others tell some tales about what I call the pale crawlers, the tall, skinny, pale things. 7 feet tall, extremely pale, almost to the point of glowing. Black pits for eyes. No mouth, no visible reproductive organs apparently. Spindly limbs and fingers with long claws. Take this with a grain of salt, but I find the stories to be sincere. The first one is from a girl named Jakey who was with a group of her friends, going on a kind of dangerous night hike in the Red River Gorge. That's part of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern KY, and it's absolutely massive. Hundreds of thousands of continuous acres of nothing but mountains and woods. And then there's land close by that's managed for wildlife, so it's also empty. Just thick woods with a cabin here and there, very isolated. The group was going on a very well-known trail called the Natural Bridge Trail, which ends at an awesome overlook spot, and it draws in like hundreds of thousands of people a year. I've been myself about 1,000 times, lol. Anyways, the short version is they saw this critter as they were coming back down the mountain, after having some other weird things happen. It was crouched by a tree, and when they all stopped and shined their lights on it, the thing stood up. And that's when they realized 1. It wasn't human, and 2. It was aggressive. It chased them the rest of the way down the trail, all the way up to the trailhead where the parking lot was. Luckily, it was partially lit with streetlights, so I guess the thing didn't want to come out in the light, and they made it to their cars and left. She's told this story online, I think, and also created a website to document this experience. Her and each of the people present drew a picture of what they interpreted this thing, whatever it is, and yeah, I'd say it's nightmare fuel. Gives me pause when I think about camping overnight, no joke. If it's a hoax, it's well done. I know she's been to that part of the Red River Gorge. Between the information she provides about the trail itself and the photos they took of the area after the encounter, it's undeniably the Red River Gorge. I think she may be telling the truth. I'm not sure which year this occurred, but I don't think it was more than a few years ago. I believe I was stalked in the woods today. For context, I am 16 meters from the UK and am 6 feet 6 inches, so I have a scary figure to look at and don't deal well with strangers. I also have a very hard time expressing my emotions and will usually walk in the woodland area down by my house to clear my head. It always works and is especially effective at times from 2200 hours to 2:30, and I've never had any problems with these walks. Today I left the house a little after 2200 hours and decided a quick walk before it got dark would be best. I got to the darkest area of the woods, yet it still looked light between the trees, so I continued on. I kept walking until I reached the metal bridge over a thin stream. Now at this point I could keep walking my usual path or go to my left and take a longer route that I am unfamiliar with. I would never have gone to look down this second option, but something made me want to go explore a little bit into the area. It was still light after all. I ended up in that unknown area for around 5 minutes before deciding to head back as it had suddenly gotten dark very quickly. I turned around with my phone's torch lighting up a path I was completely unfamiliar with, but I knew it was the only way out and decided to follow back. This path was strangely unfamiliar despite it being the same route I had taken into the area. I kept walking and realized I had no memory of entering this new section of the woods and became very panicked and distressed. However, I made it back to the metal bridge and crossed back to my usual path. I walked along my route and made it to my favorite spot at the bottom of a 200-foot quarry, which has become overgrown with summer vegetation, where I decided to rest my legs and read a book I had brought with me. I sat with my torch facing the book, reading quietly to myself and hearing a faint raspy noise coming from the top of the quarry, almost as if someone were breathing through a gas mask. I closed my book, and the sound was now too prominent to ignore. I swiveled my torch in the direction of the sound, and it gasped almost as if it were holding its breath. I pointed my torch back to my bag to zip it up and put my book away, and the sound became heavier. Once I'd finished putting my book away, I placed the torch in my lap so that the light was on my face and began to search the tree line at the top of the quarry to see if I could spot anyone. But when I looked directly at the sound, it once again took a short gasp and stopped. I was terrified that I stood up, and the noise began to move away from me and round the top of the quarry, still rasping and now rocks crunching underneath some sort of weight. It was the first time in my life that I was frozen and began hyperventilating due to my fear. I stood still in the dark, listening to this thing that had stalked me for the past 5 minutes slowly move across the quarry's ridge and seeing rocks falling down to my level. I genuinely believed that someone wearing some sort of breathing device had been listening to me, read my book and watched as I tried to find out where they were. I don't know what compelled me to go into the unknown area or why I decided to go to the quarry despite it being so late, but I am now certain of one thing. I am never going to that quarry alone again, no matter how bad emotions become. Woods of Antroville, South Carolina. There's been this kind of spooky story in my family about a guy who chops down trees at night. You can hear him. In the woods you can run towards him, but you can never catch up, and the sound will move like an axe slapping the trees around the same time every evening. The problem with this is it has been going on for almost 80 years, and many family members have tried to locate the source of the sound. There for a while it had stopped, and then we brought it up, and it began again. It has never stopped, but it's almost as if it manifests energy by talking about it. It is the woods off of Brownlee Road, facing the Highway 28 side. No one has ever found chopped trees or fallen stumps or anything of the like, and the woods are a regular hiking and walking area. This confuses me. It is single chop noises with slight interval pauses. Does anyone know what this could be? This is Obville, South Carolina. The summer after I graduated high school, I did a solo overnight in some woods near an old plantation. I had a nice setup and was getting ready to cook some steak. I even made a fence with some branches. I heard something walking in the leaves, like something big was thumping steadily towards me. I called out no bear, but it kept coming until I should have seen it with my headlamp. Nothing there. I booked it to the car, leaving everything. Then I was worried about the fire, so I headed back. On a semi-overgrown gravel road leading to the wooded area, I heard it again, a steady thump 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 getting closer. I came back the next day with my bro, and the fire had fortunately gone out, but my steak was cooked, in a covered in flies don't eat kind of way. There are a few other weird things that happened in that area, like seeing a shadow of a figure in a heavy robe and long hair near an old wilderness trail when I was running at twilight. An old-timer, passed now, worked on the plantation in the 30s and saw a Confederate ride by on a horse, missing everything past the upper torso with some of the other kids. This happened nearly 6 years ago, when my partner and I first got together. We decided to go camping by the beach in Coro. It's very remote, nothing for ages down the road. We were sitting on the rocky beach, and he starts telling me about a conversation he had with his mate. His mate was chatting about seeing some weird lights in the sky, and partway into their conversation, they both see the lights in the sky above them. Not even 5 minutes later, it started. I know this sounds far-fetched, but we have spent almost 6 years trying to figure it out. We are both in scientific careers, we are evidence-based people. If we had not experienced it at the same time, we would not have believed it. 2 strikes of lightning, no thunder, then lights in the sky, slowly aiming towards us. What looked like a Coast Guard searchlight started scanning across the forest around us, then stopped directly on us. This is a small bay, there were no nearby boats before this started. As the light turned off, we saw there was no boat. No lighthouse, nothing that could have created it. It lit up the entire mountainside, it definitely wasn't a torch. Then peculiar strings of lights weaving around the trees. Here's the thing. I saw them as an off-white color, my man thing saw multicolor. He's completely colorblind. They were far too fluid to be drones, the trees were very close together. Then these weird beams that looked like flashlights but didn't quite look right started signaling all around us in the sky, waving over to us then back to the sky. We were surrounded by dead branches, etc., yet we heard no footsteps. Each time we turned off the car lights, they turned on that millisecond. Too quick for a normal reaction time. They became closer and closer every time we turned the car headlights off and on, silently, until my partner quietly told me to get in the car right now. He heard laughter right beside him, but still no footsteps and no visible people. As we drove out, we saw a massive rubbish bag. About 2 meters long, stuffed full. We checked the site before putting our tent up, and it was definitely not there. I work in the bush out in the WAPs, I know how to safely establish a tent site. We heard no plastic rustling either that would explain it being moved there. We were sober, straight, and of sound mental health. To this day we have no idea what it was. I scoured the internet, local libraries, etc. Nothing. So I just realized this would have been my 3rd skinwalker encounter. I put quotations because I'm seriously struggling to fully believe it, but it's happened 3 times now, so I'm not even sure what to believe. The first time I was walking back home on some train tracks at midnight on a full moon. My friends left, so it was just me when I heard an absolutely terrifying, human-like screech in the forest. I thought nothing of it till I heard it again, but closer, so I ran for my life till I got to my car. I was high too, so my paranoia was through the roof, but dismissed the screams as something that could be explained. I just didn't know. The next encounter was also at midnight while I was going for a midnight drive. I stopped on a road with a bunch of farms and a nice view. It was also a full moon. I was whistling with my window open to a song when I swore I started hearing footsteps really close and clearly around my car, and my fight or flight fully engaged, and I hit the gas as fast as I could and got the duck out. I was mainly paranoid of carjacking, but now after what happened tonight, I'm rethinking this event too. Tonight, I and my friends lit up a joint and walked into a forest. I started whistling when my friends freaked out and ran, talking about skinwalkers and how you should never whistle. I dismissed them as joking, and the second we got out, we heard the most blood-curdling, spine-chilling scream from the forest, and I swear I started praying the moment my fight or flight engaged. And I'm writing this now to cope with the intense paranoia of living in a forest while trying to sleep. I was out dispersed camping with my dog, just the two of us. I was over a mile from the nearest trail, and my camping gear is mostly camouflaged. I also typically set up fairly tucked away, so often you wouldn't see my campsite unless you literally walked into it. About a half hour before sunset, I had started a small fire and was prepping a couple steaks to grill. Mine gets a dry rub, the dog's goes on unseasoned and comes off just before mine. We both like them rare. I see off in the distance, about a half mile away, this lone woman walking up the hill, nonchalantly and completely nude except for a sun hat. She was carrying a woven bag like a large purse and a notebook in one hand. She came walking straight up to my campfire and asked if she could sit a while. I was flabbergasted, told her to help herself, and offered her a stool. Turns out she was a professor from a college close by. She liked to do some naked hiking and meditation. She sat and chatted with me for a bit, then went on her way. I can't imagine myself acting in such a way. Pretty privilege. I've seen some weird things and had some borderline supernatural experiences, but that was probably the weirdest thing I've ever run into while solo camping. I've spent a good amount of time solo backpacking in the actual wilderness. I've also done a lot of car camping in desolate places, and I've only ever been scared or had something weird happen once. I was set up just off of a Forest Service road in WA. I had been there for several hours, and everything seemed fine. I was sitting next to the fire, enjoying the cold, late fall night air. Then it was like a switch had been flipped. I was overcome with terror/dread. Everything changed. I felt almost paralyzed with fear. I jumped into the rig, locked up, and lay in bed all night. I just listened and waited. I would have just driven off, but this truck setup had a master switch on the truck battery, and I had turned it off when I arrived. To leave meant that I would have to go back outside, and there was no way I was going to do that. I felt like a kid lying in bed, scared of something coming out of the closet. I lay there like that all night, and nothing happened. I got the duck out in the morning. I never heard or saw anything directly, but I knew something wasn't right. I haven't experienced anything like that before or after. Hell, I've seen a wolf 200 yards away from my tent before and slept like a baby that night. Nothing has ever affected me like that night in WA. Something odd happened when my sister had a bad trip on shrooms. I'll start off by saying that I have always believed psilocybin does more than make you hallucinate. I believe it allows us to perceive more than our normal senses allow, and it possibly serves as an agent to bleed into another dimension, reality, or whatever you'd like to call it. A portal of sorts. Anyways, those are just my thoughts. My sisters took mushrooms last night at a campfire. My one sister was having a terrible trip, so I had to go get her. I wasn't surprised because this was her first trip, and she did not know these people. They were my other sister's friends. I went and got her. I brought her puppy. I took her home and I put Friends on TV for her. She appeared to calm down significantly. She barely spoke. At one point, however, she looks at me and goes, "We've lived this day so many times." Now that's more something I would say. She doesn't really ever talk like that, so I thought it was intriguing and cool at the same time. I decided it was time to go up to bed, so I left her downstairs. Things seemed back to normal. After about 10 minutes, I heard pounding on the front door. It was past midnight. Then my sister yelled my name. I start to head down the stairs where she is heading up. She looked very worried. I asked her if someone was here. She said she didn't know. There was another knock on the door. I'm like, what the hell? I go down the stairs and open the door, and there's absolutely nobody outside. I look up at my sis on the stairs, and she goes, "I don't know what to do." She looks petrified. She said she was sure she was about to die. I ended up back downstairs, and she made me dump cold water on her head a few times. There were another couple of knocks on the side window. Again, absolutely nobody was outside. She eventually came back to real life, but I'm telling you, there was a 5-minute period where my sister was really distraught after being fine for a couple of hours. And something happened. I feel like it was connected to her trip, and somehow I was experiencing something. This may sound like nothing, but I was on edge for a few minutes last night. Something was there outside my house. I just couldn't see it. Something is following me, and I fear for my life when I'm outside at night. This started happening about a year ago. I'm sharing this just to see if anyone knows why it is happening or how to stop it. The first encounter was last spring, when I and my friend decided to go hiking on this trail that's about a 10-minute walk from my house. We were about a half a mile into the trail when we heard it. It was a woman screaming for her life. She yelled and pleaded with us to come help her, but when we yelled back to ask if we should call someone, she didn't answer and kept repeating that we should come help her. I'd like to say that we immediately left the woods and called the police, but we didn't. Something in our 15-year-old minds convinced us that it would be safe for us to go check it out ourselves. We armed ourselves with rocks and headed down the trail when we heard another voice telling the women to shut up or they would kill her. Then both voices went silent. This is when we finally called the non-emergency police line, who referred us to 911, who told us to exit the trail and wait for an officer. We did, and about 10 minutes later one showed up. Like the police in most of these stories, they were no help, and they were very suspicious of 2 teenage girls calling in a possible homicide. They supposedly searched the whole 10-mile trail in about 20 minutes and came back and told us they found nothing but took our names down and told us they would get back to us if anything came up, but I guess nothing did because I never heard from them again. When I got home I told my older sister, and this is when she told me she thought it might have been a skinwalker, a native legend that our father had told us about. The skinwalker will try to lure you by disguising itself as someone you know or who needs help. I told her that was crazy, but it still lingered in the back of my mind. The next encounter takes place a few nights later. As my sister and I walked the dogs, she laughed and asked, "Why is that trash can in the middle of the road?" I looked past the gate of our community, and I saw it. It was a broad, slender creature, its arms resembling claws and legs. I told her that I didn't think it was a trash can, but I didn't know what it was. It then started moving towards us in a strange way that didn't look human, but it didn't exactly look like the way an animal moved either. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my entire life. As soon as we got home, we told my mom, and she looked at us like she thought we were crazy, but when we told my dad, he looked worried, and he told us about his experience when he was camping and saw something eerily similar to what we saw. We didn't walk the dogs at night for a good amount of time until we felt like things were normal again. Nothing happened for a while, and everything felt safe again. This happened in January. I had made new friends, and we were hanging out one night when one of them decided to show the rest of us a hideout they had made in the woods. It was a little stupid to go out in the woods at night, I know, but it was a fine neighborhood, and it felt safe enough at the time. We were walking through the woods when suddenly we heard someone screaming for help. It was a man this time. I had learned my lesson from last time, and I snapped at my friends to run and go back to the car. When we were back in the car, I told them about skinwalkers and my previous experiences, and they looked at me like I was crazy until I pulled up a video of a supposed skinwalker sighting that sounded exactly like what we had just heard. I didn't go to the woods at night for a while after that, but eventually I forgot it even happened and returned to the woods. The next encounter happened about a month ago. I thought it was over after those encounters, but apparently not. I was walking to the woods with one of my friends who was with me for the previous encounter when I dropped my phone. He pulled out his flashlight and helped me look for it because it was pitch black. That's when I heard it, this time a little boy screaming for help. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I had heard enough. I told my friend we should get out of there, and we did. The next encounter happened a few weeks ago. My sister and I were walking her dog when we heard someone screaming incoherently. We yelled back to ask if they needed help, but the voice just kept screaming. I told my sister we needed to go back, and we did. The most recent encounter happened 2 nights ago. I and my friends were walking around a ditch by their house. We didn't think it would be dangerous because we had gone there at night before. We were about half a mile away from the car when we saw it. My friend thought it was just a sign, but then it moved. It was a creature with horns or arms that it raised above its head. We could only see the outline of it because it was pitch black except for a streetlight, but it was clearly there and started moving towards us. We booked it to the car and went back to my house. I haven't been outside past dark since. I haven't told anyone about this last encounter out of fear of scrutiny for going back outside after what happened, but I feel like I have to tell someone. I know this isn't as scary as some of the other stories on here, but I'm genuinely fearing for my life. I don't know what this creature wants or how to get rid of it, but it feels good to get this off my chest. The tall stick entity. I wanted to share a truly bizarre, terrifying, and unexplainable experience I had growing up. To make note, my childhood home was a hotbed for paranormal activity. I could honestly write a book with the amount of stories I have, but this one was different from all the rest. So to start off, we lived on a small stretch of secluded highway in a wooded area. Our home was nestled on a plot of land that was a few acres, and the area surrounding us was federally protected land of the Wildlife Refuge, which means unless your house is grandfathered in, then no one can purchase land or build in this area, so we had no neighbors. Our house was a 300-year-old colonial home and held a lot of history. There was knowledge of Native Americans once residing there and a lot of war stories with the Civil and Revolutionary Wars happening on that land. There was definitely a heavy negative energy in that house and property. You always felt like you were being watched from every angle of the woods, and so many people who visited would become uneasy immediately and state their discomfort and need to leave. My family and I have countless stories we experienced individually or with one another. This particular experience was shared between myself and two brothers, so, like many nights after dinner, my dad would tell me or one of my brothers to go out back and feed the dog. This was a scary task because it would be pitch black, and our dog would be near the tree line of woods, which for some reason that section of woods would give all of us an uneasy feeling anytime we went near it, and it didn't matter the time of day, it always was creepy, but being at night was definitely terrifying. So no matter which one of us was told to go out and feed the dog, we would never leave a man behind and would always go out in a trio because we knew better than that because we wouldn't want to be left to go alone when it came our turn. So on this particular night I was probably around 11 years old, my brother being 10 and the other 7. So we would always do the same thing. Whoever was told by dad to feed the dog was the one who had to carry the bowl out, and the other two would huddle close with the person with the bowl in the middle. We would walk extremely slowly, all of us looking in different directions, surveying the property but keeping the conversations very lighthearted and being silly to keep from getting scared before completing the task. So once we reached our dog, this is where the person holding the bowl would get screwed because right before you had the chance to put it down, the other two siblings would scream something scary like Jeepers Creepers or the Jersey Devil while hauling us back to the house, so you would be left standing alone before getting the chance to run with your siblings. So on this night my brother was the one who had to hold the bowl, and as we walked out to head towards the backyard, something felt off, like the air felt static and charged, like how it feels before a lightning storm, and we could hear our dog barking like crazy, which was unusual, and as we got into sight of our dog, we saw him standing on his hind legs with the leash pulled completely tight because whatever he was barking at, he was trying with all he had to break out from that collar and go after it. That's when we heard loud branches snapping and looked towards the direction our dog was barking in. We then saw this giant black stick figure that was as tall as the trees. It was walking over this huge brush pile we had, which was why we were hearing branches breaking. The way it walked was almost mechanical in a way, and its presence felt very ominous and gave us a very dreadful feeling. At first it seemed like it didn't notice us and was just walking by, but then it turned towards us, and that's when we booked it for the house, my brother throwing the bowl of food in the air and feeling like our legs were jello. We all saw the same thing, and it scared us so badly, and unlike many stories you hear, my parents actually believed us. Anyway, fast forward years and years later, and I was having a conversation with my coworker, and we would talk about paranormal topics quite a bit, so during this conversation, she asked me if I had ever heard of Native American stick people, and as soon as she said it, I knew what she was referring to. She then tells me about these giant stick figures out in the woods that Native Americans have seen and are supposedly a totem of evil spirits, and if you encounter one and it goes after you, it then can possess you and cause you to do harm. I was so freaked out because up until then I had never heard of such a thing, but knowing the Native American history of that land, it makes me believe that they are related. Something weird happened while I was camping this summer at Mount Shasta. Every summer, I make a 3-hour scenic trek down to the Shasta Trinity Forest. For about a week, I hike the various trails, taking in the awe-inspiring beauty of Southern California. It's a truly unique experience to be hundreds of miles from civilization with nothing but the sustenance and supplies you packed. On your own, the mind has a tendency to take over. I've definitely experienced a general sense of creepiness while camping in this area, but I've never felt physically threatened. This feeling persisted until the end of the summer. It was September, near Labor Day. The golden sunset cast a reddish-pink sky as far as the eye could see. I had come to a clearing and decided it was a good place to make camp for the evening. By now, it was day 3. I had been hiking for almost 72 hours, with breaks on and off to sleep for about 6 to 8 hours. I loved hiking during the sunrise. I started to make camp and was alarmed when a tremor struck the surrounding area. The ground shook for a solid 15 to 20 seconds before it let up. I had never experienced an earthquake in this area, but I was aware that Mount Shasta was a semi-active volcano. I didn't think much of it, as I was in a fairly open space and figured I'd be relatively safe or wake up if it happened again. I dozed off to sleep. Normally, I'd sleep all throughout the night. However, this night was different. I woke up suddenly just feeling off. It wasn't like I was sick or anything. It felt more like an impulse that something was wrong. I noticed the hair on my arms was standing up straight, and it felt as if there was a heavy electrostatic charge in the air. I quickly rummaged around my tent and peered outside. The air was dead, and there was absolutely no sound. I found this particularly disturbing as you can always hear crickets, birds, insects, and general wildlife. There was not even a slight breeze. It was dead silent. The only sounds being made were the shuffling of my boots against the cold, damp ground beneath me. Aside from absolutely no sound, the sky didn't look quite right. It was absolutely pitch black. No moonlight. You couldn't even see a single star. I couldn't even tell if there was cloud coverage, it was literally too dark. I started to panic a bit. Packing up my gear, I still heard absolutely no external sounds coming from the forest around me. I swung my pack over my shoulder, containing my tent, water, and other assorted gear, and made my way back towards the main trail. With only a flashlight to guide me, the shadows extended onto the trail before me. As I reached a fork, I could hear a low humming noise, almost like a generator of some sort. I tried to look around with my flashlight, but I could just see the dense trees and shrubbery that made up the forest. As I continued on, the humming sound grew louder and louder. Its pitch grew, almost into a whining sound. I came to the conclusion that it was definitely electrical in nature. I branched the fork to head back to the main road. By now, all I wanted was to leave this place. As I continued on, there was a bright blue light I could make out just in the distance. I had never seen anything like it. It brilliantly shone through the branches and cast into the sky a bit. The whining sound grew louder and louder as I neared this light. The sky was still pitch black, but it had started to shimmer. It was unnerving, it almost looked like a cloak of some kind, bending the available light and projecting a false image. Wind gusts noticeably picked up as I trotted on, but they felt artificial. Something was deliberately causing them. I slowed down a bit, utterly confused at this point, when suddenly I heard a voice yell in plain English, "Grab him." I swung around and felt a force push me. I flew back a good 6 feet but immediately bounced up to face my assailant. Only to find there was nobody there. I looked up. Suddenly, there was a star-filled sky. I turned to pursue the blue light, only to find it gone. I could hear crickets, insects, and general nighttime sounds again. To this day, I'm not sure what I encountered at Mount Shasta. Whatever it was beyond our current comprehension and likely our current model of physics. Something in the woods. So this is not as crazy as some of the things I've listened to on here, but it's a genuine experience that's always had me wondering. I work as a broadcast engineer, and a few years ago I received a phone call around 9:30 to 10 p.m. from the on-duty ENG saying that our OTA, over-the-air, signal had gone out and we were off the air on our OTA platform. The call was with several other ENGs as well as my boss at the time. We determined that the issue stemmed from our transmitter and required manual correction. After a few awkward seconds of silence, my boss asked for someone to volunteer to go with him. So our RF transmitter site was located on top of Beacon Mountain in Beacon, New York, which was about an hour plus from our station. At the time, I had never been up there, so going in the middle of the night was a little spooky. I met my boss, and we drove together and got to the mountain a little before midnight. The road up the mountain to the transmitter site is a long, narrow, windy, and steep dirt road with a lot of big, loose rocks, so the drive up and down is scary enough. I can't emphasize enough how dark this drive was. Like pitch black. A few times while going up, we would see headlights coming towards us of people out with their off-road jeeps, which wouldn't be as weird if it weren't the middle of the night. We also saw 2 different campfires deep in the woods, which I just assumed were groups of locals hanging out drinking. My boss told me that locals hung out near the transmitter sites sometimes and should be avoided as they had a tendency to be sketchy. Didn't seem too sketchy to me, but what did I know? It was my first time there. My boss also told me that he never travels to that mountain without a gun. He said it's more than the locals, I've seen stuff out here I can't really explain. We get to the top, do our work on our transmitter, close everything up, and start to head back down. As we were heading down, We were at a particularly steep part of the road when you pretty much have to ride your brake because the car won't stop till the incline levels out a little. All of a sudden, 3 deer sprint out in front of us, not even looking at our oncoming car, causing us to swerve since we were already riding the brake. The front of the car hit a rock, which stopped our momentum. My boss instantly turned the car off, and once the sound of the engine died, we heard something big run in the opposite direction away from the road up the natural slope of the hill. I shined my flashlight in the direction, but whatever it was already out of sight. We could still see branches moving and leaves settling from being disturbed by whatever ran away. I asked my boss if he thought that was another deer or possibly a bear, and he replied, "Bears run on all fours, whatever that was ran on 2 legs. And bears don't hunt deer, something was chasing them." When we first heard the footsteps, I would estimate they were as close as 10 to 15 feet from the car when it started to run away but appeared to be standing over us as there was a natural incline up the mountain. There are a lot of logical explanations, like that my boss was just trying to scare me or that it was a local walking/running through the woods, but here are a few things to consider. Yes, it could have been a person walking alone through the woods, but why chase the deer? And why run away from the car? Also, whatever ran away was out of sight quickly. Like within 3 to 4 seconds of starting to run up the hill. This person would have to be in the greatest shape ever to run that quickly up this hill. This also sounded way too big to be a bobcat, mountain lion, or coyote. My boss is not the kind of guy that would try to scare people. He's a very stern, all business type of guy. He seemed pretty rattled by this and wanted to get off the mountain ASAP. I ended up going back up that mountain many more times before leaving for a new job, and I never saw or heard anything like that night. However, I never went back after sunset. I no longer work for this company, and this company no longer owns the transmitter site, so I will likely never have a reason to go back. I don't know of any reported sightings or experiences in the area, but I do know that over the years there have been many car accidents on that road. I assume all the accidents are due to the poor condition of it, but honestly I have no idea. Why I quit hiking on trails in the Ozarks. Starting about 15 years ago, pretty much every time I hiked a trail, someone would come up to me and demand I bail them out of the predicament they got themselves into. They were all-day hikers who were lost and starving, hungry, and thirsty, so I gave them my food and water and led them back to their car. One thing most all of them had in common was that as soon as I got them back to their car, they took off as fast as they could without so much as a simple, "Thank you." This was because they were so lost they had no clue where they were while I was leading them back to their car, and by the time I got them back, they had become so seriously paranoid that, I suppose, they must have thought I was leading them somewhere to rob and or murder them. I never carry a gun, but I always carry a fillet knife strapped to my belt, and I suppose that might have freaked them out a bit, but I did my best to try and ease their worries while guiding them back. But as for me, I had to head home too, and most all of them didn't think at all or care a bit about that. The last time that happened, I decided to stop hiking the trails and start bushwhacking instead. Since then, I plan a route and sketch it on a printed topo map and give it to my wife in case I don't make it back. I'll add that I practice LNT for those who might want to assume we shouldn't do that. Since doing that, I've not seen anyone while I'm out there, and I've found some great spots to set up my campsite and hang out for a few days. I quit caring about how many miles I hiked and slowed down and took the time to stop and really absorb the area I was in. I learned to turn around now and then and study what it looked like so I could recognize where I am on the way back. I learned that when I sat quietly for a bit, the wildlife would start coming back out of hiding and get back to doing what they do, and it's really pretty cool to witness. For me, I found a slow 2-mile hike off trail is far more enjoyable than racing along on a trail to rake up miles. As for ticks, chiggers, snakes, etc., locals here don't hike in the forests during summer in the Ozarks. We hike and backpack from November to March when they're hunkering down, and campfires are legal because we very rarely have any risk of forest fires here. What you are about to read is a warning. I beg you. I implore you, please, do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer, southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single goddamn thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. 1. Animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And 2, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I'd been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. The point being, I know those woods really well, but some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I'd managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I did not recognize my surroundings. And I cannot understate how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it gradually began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight. So that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That or the moss in this area grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told myself there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never, ever seen in those woods before, something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979, so just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anyone was home, and, as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness, maybe my blood sugar was low, I'm not entirely sure, but for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return, don't look back, never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that, every so often, the cabin did actually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. I saw Drew's attention. What I'm about to attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind, a small statuette sat atop a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. And I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin. I fled into the darkness. The night. You read that right, when I walked into that cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes, at least, that's what it felt like. Only when I burst through that wooden door, It was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back at home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're listening to this, heed my warning. And do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Paranormal experiences in the woods of eastern Kentucky? I am sharing this mostly to try and find some sort of community or answers. I am in Moorhead, Kentucky, and have been experiencing unexplainable things while I've been hiking around Eagle Lake or near Cave Run. I'm not a superstitious person and am very rational when it comes to the animals in our region. It will sound as if something is approaching, coming much closer than any animal should, and when noticed, I react, stomp my feet, etc., it stops. An unrelenting dread and overwhelming anxiety fall over me, I cannot shake it, and I know I have to leave at that point. Each time, as I've started to leave, whatever it is has charged quickly, coming much closer and essentially chasing me from where I've been. I refused to return to Eagle Lake after I experienced it the first time and chose to go to a pretty popular area near Cave Run. The same exact thing has happened more than once. I have not been able to shake the feeling. I have definitely been the only one in the area on both occasions, and there have been no animals near, definitely not ones large enough to make the sounds I've heard. My girlfriend has been with me on each occasion and has heard and felt the same as me. If anyone has seen, felt, or heard anything, please let me know. I have a book of these because of this very strange old place I grew up way out in the Idaho mountains. So I was and am something of a skeptical believer in that I fully believe there are things in this world and beyond that we cannot fully comprehend or explain. But I think most claims out there can be boiled down to just a lack of understanding of things and or a desire for what they experience to be paranormal. People who want to see ghosts, so when there's a trick of the light, they see a ghost. This place of which I speak is not such a far-reaching delusion as that. I grew up here. My adoptive father was a roofer and outdoorsman and just a really great guy. He had friends everywhere. I'll spare you the full-length story, but because a good friend of his was dying of cancer, he was called upon to run this secluded cabin rental hot springs resort up in the mountains when I was 6. I had visited the place frequently with my brother and stepmother when he would bring us up fishing, camping, or hunting. I loved it to find that we'd be staying there. Even though my time was split between him and my biological mother down in town. I still spent most of my childhood in those mountains since I was 6. Aside from just loving the place for all the freedom I had catching frogs and climbing trees and swimming in the river, I think there were very few nights that I wasn't awoken in the night by something in that cabin. I'd wake up to dark shapes looming over me in the darkness that would recoil as I woke up. The sounds of things falling and breaking in the night, but in the morning there was nothing broken. Or the sounds of someone walking on the creaky old floor but there being no one there. I was amazingly unfazed by any of this. I knew everyone else experienced things, but almost no one would talk about it. I never really pushed, though. I was a kid, and when the day came, I was back up to my normal kid things. There was a night, though, that I think everyone had to acknowledge and question the strange things that went on. At the time, the cabin we stayed in was small. There were no additions made to it, so it was one large room except the bathroom. One main bed where the old man and stepmom slept. I stayed on a couch, and my brother slept on a cot. There was a loft that you couldn't stand and that was mostly used for storage, too. But we all slept in the one room. No one was bothered since we all came from near poverty anyway. It was this one night that we all awoke to screaming and the loud clatter of everything, including the lamp on my stepmom's nightstand, being thrown across the room. Everyone woke up with a jump, and my old man turned on his lamp, and we just saw stepmom sitting up in bed, eyes wide and pale. She was still yelling, "Where is it? Look for it." When we all collectively asked what she was talking about, she just sort of quieted down. She made it very clear she didn't want to talk about it and that it must have been a dream. But after we cleaned up all the broken stuff and laid back down to go back to sleep, no one believed her. I don't think anyone slept that night. Even the next day we couldn't get out of her what she had seen at the foot of her bed that made her freak out the way she did. We all doubted it was a dream, though. She had made it very clear, she never wanted to talk about it and wanted everyone to just forget it had happened. And you almost could forget. It never happened again. Not long after she convinced the old man to build an extension on the cabin to give them an actual bedroom. I never forgot, though. There was this glass angel figurine that stood about 1.5 feet tall that she'd gotten at a yard sale years before that sat across the room on the old box TV we had that was broken when she threw her lamp across the room at whatever she saw. There was a lot of stuff broken by accident that she just threw out, but she had tried to fix the glass angel. And so it sat there, Pretty well fixed, actually, on top of the TV for years, even until after she died, as a constant reminder of that night to me. I was in Porcupine Mountains State Park in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had hiked a long day, and it was kinda hot. I felt sick, so I set up my tent near a small river to lay down. While resting, I heard and felt the vibration of a very, very fast thumping. I could tell it was not that close, and I wondered if it was a rabbit or something scratching with its hind leg and it thumping the ground. But the force in which I felt the vibration was tremendous, and I was racking my brain the whole time. What could this be? Every animal in every scenario made no sense. The spread was also very, very fast. Almost unnaturally fast, but not machine-like. It had its own organic rhythm. It freaked me out quite a bit. The thumping was very bassy and heavy. I could see nothing around that would do this either. It was broad daylight. Something tried to lure me into the woods. Southwest Pennsylvania a few years ago, after I moved into my new house, I was going to feed the chickens. It was late, around 9:30 p.m., so it's pretty dark out. I have a pretty big yard with a fence around it because we used to have horses. The chickens are located close to the fence, away from the house. They have their own little house. As I was giving the chickens their food, a female voice called to me from right beyond the fence, and it said, "Hey, come here." I was around 15 at the time, 21 now, and I can still hear the voice as clear as day. I cannot describe the chills that went through me as I turned around and stared directly into the darkness. I proceeded to walk backwards 15 to 20 feet without saying a word, fearing what would happen if I turned around. I felt something was there, and it was not friendly, but when I thought it was safe enough, I turned around and bolted back to the house. I immediately told my mom, and then my sister's fiancé at the time, who is a Marine, trailed the entire fence line, and on the outside of the fence, close to where the chicken pen is, there were clear disturbances in the bushes like something was standing there, but there was nothing. I do not feel safe going outside anymore at night in the backyard. The man in the river. My friend and I explored creeks in my town because they were unexplored, and we found cool stuff. It was summer, so we didn't have much to do. I should mention that our parents never wanted us doing this because they were nervous about us being in dangerous places. So we go into a creek that we had just found on the far side of town, and we were excited because it looked like we were gonna find some cool stuff. We even had backpacks to pick up things. We went walking, and as we walked, we noticed that there were clothes everywhere, not like they were folded up but like they were thrown, as if someone had to suddenly abandon them. We didn't think much of it, but after we walked for about a half mile, my friend suddenly shouts, "Hey, insert my name here, come over here, I found something," and when I looked, he was visibly shaken. Now my friend never gets that scared. During the summer we had gone to abandoned places, creepy creeks, and a ton of other stuff but never got scared, so I knew something was wrong. I was getting concerned, so I ran over there, and I'll never forget what we saw. A bloody knife next to what looked to be a severed limb. I couldn't make it out because of how much blood there was. I was about to ask my friend what we should do when I saw him staring at something else. A man about 50 feet away from us was hunched over something. A trail of blood led up to him. He looked at us slowly, and he was holding a weapon that I couldn't make out, and that's when I heard my friend scream, "Run," and we sprinted away. As we were running, I could see the figure approaching, so in a split-second decision, I hurled the backpack I had at his face, but I've never been a good aim, and I saw that it missed, but luckily my friend had seen and did the same, and I heard the impact and knew it hit. We finally got out, but since we were on the border of the town, there was nothing around, and we had at least another mile walk back to our houses, a long walk back to any houses. As we were running, my friend shouted at me to call the police, and that's when I realized that the backpack that I threw at the guy had my phone in it. So we basically had no hope of the police coming and were being chased by someone with a knife. We were faster, though, and we managed to get back to the houses. I had to tell my parents that I lost my phone and I didn't get another for another year. I was so confused afterward because I didn't know what had happened. I only understood it when a few days after my mom told me that there had been an insane man who had been carving up animals in that river. I still have no explanation for the clothes or the limb, and I never told someone for the fear that they would get mad at me for going into a river without their permission. Needless to say, my friend and I didn't go exploring after that. He was never the same after that experience, and we drifted apart a few years later. But yeah, that's my terrifying story. The moral of the story is if you go to weird places like that where nobody's around, make sure people know where you are because in the situation I was in, nobody would know where I was, and I don't want to think about what could have happened, so I'm not saying don't do it, but make sure people know where you are and what time you'll be back so if this stuff happens, people will know where you are. Also, this will seem cheesy, But if your parents are telling you something is dangerous and they forbid you from doing it, just don't do it. They probably know more about that than you, especially if you're younger. Just wait until you're an adult and see if you want to do it more. At an established campground, solo camping. I rolled my sleeping bag out on the picnic table, love a cozy cowboy camp, and went up to the bathroom. On my way to the bathroom, I noticed a person with a red headlamp walking into the campgrounds. By the time I finished, maybe 5 minutes, this person was nowhere to be seen. Nothing too sketchy yet, but my brain took note and was on higher alert. I get back to my campsite and start putting on my bed socks when I hear a crunch of leaves/sticks from the tree line behind me. Thinking it must be a deer or some other wildlife, we don't have anything too scary in my area, no bears, big cats, etc. I shine my flashlight at the noise. A pair of eyes about the height of a red headlamp person reflect right back at me. I ran to the camper of an older gentleman who told me earlier to come knock if I needed anything. We went to investigate, but nothing was there. Just as we were turning back, he graciously offered his fold-out bed for the night. I saw a figure emerge from the tree line back up by the bathroom and flick on a red headlamp. I don't know what this person wanted, but I don't think it was anything good. I will always be indebted to the older gentleman and his wife for their kindness. Real-life encounter with the boogeyman. Okay, so I don't really know how to start this. It's the most messed up thing that has ever happened to me. So my sophomore year of college, my best friend and I decided to take an Adderall so we could stay up all night and write the papers that were due that week. So we did it, and we stayed up really late and finally finished. It was about 3 a.m. when we decided to go get some food and smoke a joint. So we get in the car and get the food and decide to smoke in the car at her apartment complex with the windows down. I'm not sure if you have ever had a bug on your body and felt it, yet ignored it because you were just busy or thought it was something else, only to finally look and see that it really was a big ducking bug. That's what this next part was like. So as soon as we pulled into the parking spot, which was facing head-on toward a big opening of woods, I felt like something was weird. But I just took a few bites of my food and rolled the joint anyway, thinking I was just spooking myself, but the whole time something felt off, and I felt like I could see something in the forest. The beginning of the forest was about 8 feet from my car. Finally, when we've been smoking the joint for about 2 minutes, I decide to actually look harder at the woods and the movement I was seeing. Immediately as I look closer, I see 2 huge yellow eyes staring back at me. It was like they were just really big eyes on a white face peeking at me through the bush. Terrifying enough as it is, it doesn't end here. As soon as I made eye contact with it, the monster, or monster man, starts coming straight for my car. Note that my lights were on, so whoever this was definitely knew we were in there, and I know it had been watching for a long time by the weird feelings I had before. I knew it had been staring right at my eyes for a while because when I finally looked, we made direct eye contact. It starts walking towards me, making direct eye contact with me still. At first, my friend and I thought it was a police officer because we had weed, but it suddenly became clear that it was no police officer, and we aren't sure it was even human. This thing was either a man dressed like a monster or it was a monster. It looked like it had a mask of pale white rotting skin on its face. I was frightened that I had a lot of trouble driving away. My first instinct was to hide and slide low in my seat, but I knew it was coming for me. I stared at the thing in paralyzed fear as it came closer and closer to me. I can't describe to you exactly what it was wearing or what it looked like because it doesn't make any sense. It's like my mind can't even go there. All I know is that it has the physique of a man, but the limbs were far too long. It looked like Slender Man but was different, like it definitely had a face. Finally, I threw my car in reverse just in time. Thank goodness it was already on, and I didn't have to search for the key or anything. When I finally was able to pull away, IT was standing in my very parking spot I had just been parked in. My friend and I called the police and told them there was a monster or a man in the woods. They said they checked but found nothing. We had been in my best friend's very own apartment complex when this happened, so we had to live with this memory every day. I have never walked to my app from my car without being on the phone with someone since that night, and it is 4 years later. It haunts me, and I hate that someone or something has scarred me so much just by one insane encounter. People always say things like, "Oh, it was a hunter, and it was blurry because they were in camouflage," but I'm telling y'all this was not a hunter, it was just too large to be a normal person, and also, not only that, but you can't hunt 50 feet from an apartment complex? There are also no hiking trails of any sort, and no normal person would deliberately stare at someone for 20 minutes and purposely scare 2 girls at 4 a.m. This was either a malicious person or a true monster. Unfortunately, I and the girl who encountered it too lean more towards monster. People also say funny things like, "Oh, you were high and delusional being up so late, so you just imagined it." First of all, I was in my right mind enough to know what I saw. Period. Also, my friend and I saw the exact same thing at the same time and experienced it together. We both described the exact same thing. I have done some research, and the only thing that I feel like it was comparable to was a rake. But the thing I saw was even scarier than the rake pics on the internet. Please tell me if anyone knows what this was or has dealt with a scary situation. I honestly have no clue what really came at me and my friend that night, and I'm just dying to figure it out because it just seems like this ominous boogeyman is haunting me. Something that watched me from the woods. When I was 10, I was at a lake way out in the woods on some land my dad owned. I was alone aside from my dog, an Airedale Terrier. I had only been fishing on the little pier in the southeast corner for about 10 minutes when I noticed something or someone watching me from the tree line on the other side of the lake. I was only 10, but I kept my composure. For some reason I felt it important that whoever it was did not know I was aware. Anyway, it started moving slowly from tree to tree, never taking its eyes off of me. The lake was about 75 yards wide, so I couldn't see any details, but I could tell which way the figure was facing. I realized that it was stalking me, and I nonchalantly put my pole down and walked down the pier and up the bank towards the trail back to our cabin. Once I hit the tree line, I hauled ass to the cabin and waited there with one of my dad's guns until my parents got home. The only witness I had was my dog, and he saw it as well. I know because he was staring intently at the figure while giving a low growl until I quietly told him to stop. I have no idea who or what it could have been, but I know its intentions were most definitely not good. This took place in southwest Mississippi near the Alabama border, back in the early 90s. We didn't live there, our home was in Mobile, Alabama, but we spent most weekends up there. I know it could have been a person, but the nearest neighbor was a very old couple that lived a few miles away. The closest paved road was a good 15 to 20 minute drive away from our land. Aside from the lake and the open area our cabin was on, the surrounding area was all really thick forest. The figure was extremely tall as well. I have an extremely good memory, especially for details. Also, shortly before I actually noticed it, I got a very strong "I'm being watched by something dangerous" feeling. I never felt safe there again, and I was glad when my dad sold it and got a place near Gulf Shores. Anyway, I wish I could have seen more details, or maybe not. I think we accidentally summoned a spirit in the woods. This story takes place in November of 2022. At the time I drew a special elk tag in the Beaverhead mountain range of central/east Idaho. I had hunted in this area many times before over the years, and I know the area like the back of my hand. It became a place of comfort and good memories. It still is, but I haven't looked at it the same since the story I am about to tell. I planned a week-long trip for the first week of November and took one of my best friends with me. We spent the first 4 days hiking up and down various ridges, chasing elk, and having a blast. The nights were spent storytelling and eating soup by the stove. Mind you, it was November in Idaho, so it was very cold. It was the 4th night of the trip. It had snowed during the day, and a fresh layer of snow lay on the ground. The sky had since cleared up, and a frigid but still and quiet air had settled in. My friend and I had gotten into a deep discussion about the Bible, spirits, cryptids, skinwalkers, etc. I should note that my friend had at the time been experiencing a decline in his mental health, and it was not uncommon for him to sometimes behave erratically. This will be relevant later in the story. During this conversation I felt an intense fear kind of settle on me. It almost felt like the air had become tense. I had the urge to change the discussion into something else, but that's when it happened. Within 20 or 30 yards of the tent, what I thought at first was a coyote began yipping and barking very, very loudly. I looked at my friend, who became excited and told me to grab my gun so we could go look for this thing. It was strange, though, and something didn't feel right. The animal, whatever it was, didn't exactly sound like a coyote. It almost shrieked as opposed to yipping the way coyotes do, and it would occasionally bark and, at times, almost scream. I'm also an experienced outdoorsman, and any other hunter knows a coyote would not approach a tent in the middle of nowhere and draw attention to itself. It would continue to vocalize for about 3 to 5 minutes at a time, circling the tent from a distance. I reluctantly grabbed my rifle and my spotlight, a very bright, intense flashlight, and started looking for this thing. As I stepped about 10 yards away from the tent, I heard it again directly in front of me, shrieking, barking, etc. I shined my light directly at it. I could see probably 150 to 200 yards in front of me. Yet nothing was there. No eyes shining in the light, no outline of an animal or person, nothing. After repeating this same scenario 3 or 4 times, we gave up and went back in the tent to warm up. But the sound wouldn't stop. At one point when it went silent, My friend poked his head out of the tent and yelled, "Hey! Shut up!" He was immediately answered with a scream from the animal. At times it sounded like it came from above the tent in the tree we were camped under. I tried playing it off as a coyote or maybe a hunting dog that got lost, but I could not convince myself it was either of those, and we ignored it for the rest of the time. It slowly started going further and further away from the tent until it finally stopped about an hour or so later. The next morning I looked around the area for tracks, yet to my surprise I found nothing but our own. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the trip, and a few days later we went home. Now I don't know if it is at all related, but about 3 months after this, my friend had a complete mental breakdown, and has since never been on a hunting trip. Some in his family, a deeply religious family, questioned whether he was the victim of some spiritual attack or something of that nature. I didn't correlate the two at the time, but in hindsight I have so many questions about that night. Is it a coincidence that whatever that animal was appeared during that particular conversation? Could it have actually been a coyote or wolf? Why couldn't I see any eyes gleaming with the flashlight? Did this incident have something to do with my friend's mental decline? My friend would sometimes tell me and others about strange things he saw or heard. Was this related? If anyone has anything to point out, please share. The Magic Tree, Strange Happenings. I used to go to a small private school about 30 kilometers from Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. I was living on campus, which was surrounded by beautiful virgin temperate rainforest. Near the school was a prison, just a way down the coastline. I had not been there long when one night I went out to a place I knew in the forest near the water. Students would often go to this place at night. It was called the Magic Tree because the tree actually grew out over the intertidal zone, so when the tide was up, all sorts of fish and crabs and such could be seen beneath you when in the tree. I went there one night for a smoke. To get there I had to walk about 150 meters down to a path and then go off the path to the left, going down a hill, going through a bit of forest, and going through the forest about 100 meters. I was not very far from where I lived, but still distant enough. I was sitting there smoking when I heard a sound, about 50 meters away or so, like a really loud, deep, raspy breathing. At first I was just like, what animal could that be? And then it stopped. I waited and continued to smoke, and the same sound resumed much closer, perhaps half the distance. Then it stopped for another couple of minutes and resumed, this time much, much closer, closer than 10 meters. I started to wonder whether I should run or what. I am someone who is very comfortable in the forest at night, and I had never heard anything like this before. It stopped again, I relaxed a bit, and then, louder than ever, this deep, struggled breathing was right in my ear. I was so shocked that I quite literally jumped out of the tree into the knee-deep water below and started running up shore. I ran for a minute and came around a bend and decided I wasn't going to let anything stop me from finishing my cigarette. A minute later, the same sound again, very near me once again. This time I took off in such a panic that I fell into a hole, got out of it, and kept running all the way back to my door. I had cut myself when I had fallen and had blood running down my knee. The next day I went back alone during the day. What I found was quite scary. I had fallen into a hole in the ground the shape of a grave, and there were 2 other such holes nearby. This whole experience was bizarre, but I attributed it to animals or something until about a month later. I was staying at a retreat center on an island north of Vancouver. I ended up meeting a couple who had taught at my school in its first years. They started telling me many stories about the history of the area, including some grim details. Where the prison had once been was a tuberculosis quarantine center mainly for Chinese immigrants from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Apparently, the quarantine center would bury dead detainees in the forest several km away, that is to say, underneath the tennis court and the forest beyond. They described precisely where I had this crazy experience. I told them about the holes in the forest, and I was told that they were the graves that had gone unfilled. How does a person with tuberculosis sound when they are dying? Struggled, raspy breathing, such as I heard? Very creepy. I have never returned to that place at night alone. One other time I heard the same sound again while sitting in the same tree with a friend. It didn't come any nearer. I was doing a quick solo overnighter in WV with my dog in the late fall to test out some new gear. The section of trail was off the beaten path and had no real overlooks, water points, scenic areas, shelters, etc. I was about 10 miles from the closest trailhead. Just flat woods and a rarely traveled trail. As it got dark, I moved about 300 yards off trail and found a small cliff face, maybe 50 high x 100 wide. I walked around it and set up camp in a draw, completely out of sight of the trail. The sun sets, it's been dark for a few hours. I have a tiny fire going and am reading quietly while my dog is snoozing. Suddenly my dog becomes alert and stares up at the top of the cliff. A minute goes by, and he stands up and starts growling softly. I get out of my hammock and shine a light at the top of the cliff. There is some middle-aged dude just standing there wearing a camo army poncho with the hood up. It wasn't raining and wasn't going to. He was just staring at me. I said hi and asked if everything was okay. He didn't say a word. Just stared at me for another 15 seconds, then turned around and walked out of sight. Never saw him again. Stalked by a possible skinwalker in Taos, New Mexico. Some quick background. I was visiting the Southwest in 2021. I flew out to Tucson, stayed a couple of days, then rented a car and drove out to the Grand Canyon and took RT-46 to Gallup, stayed there, and ended my trip in Taos. I took most of the trip alone, but my boyfriend ended up meeting me for the time I spent in Taos. He had never seen the Southwest, and as a 32-year-old woman traveling alone, he felt better accompanying me on the last leg of the trip. I have always loved Arizona and New Mexico. Since I was little, my grandmother has had a trailer in Tucson. She would snowbird off to escape the winters. I would visit her, and I first stepped foot in NM when I was 17. I fell in love with it. The energy is like no other. I respect the land and the culture out west and try to stay humble towards the dangers as they are very different than NY and NJ. My BF was not crazy about Taos. He said he felt strange and out of place there and inexplicably just depressed and down. I felt very good. I noticed an electricity in the air, and I appreciated the overall spirit. On our last night, he wanted to check out Santa Fe, which he loved. We had a good time, but after dinner we had to start heading back because we had a very early flight home. We were driving back up towards Taos. It was around 9:30 at night, and we were talking and goofing around. Suddenly he decides to say the word. It's a word you shouldn't say. I made him promise not to say it here. He did it anyway and started laughing. I was so upset with him. I said that it was disrespectful to dismiss things that he knows nothing about. He brushed it off, and I said, it's all a bunch of lore, and nothing is going to happen. We are staying in an old 1960s trailer out in a wide open pasture. Other trailers are sprinkled around, but all in all, it's fairly remote. We get back around 11, and we pack for the early flight. By the time we got to sleep, it was 12, and we realized this is more like a nap than it is actually sleep. Anyways, lucky for me, I am a deep sleeper, so I pass out right away. Around 2 or 2:30 a.m. he wakes me up, but I notice he is talking fast and anxiously with a lump in his throat. Get up, come on, get up, we have to get out of here. I thought at first it was because we maybe overslept and he was anxious about missing the early flight. It wasn't until I saw his face in the dim light of the wall sconce that I saw the terror in his eyes. His eyes were wide and watery, as if he was on the verge of breaking down. Now he is a big, tough Italian Puerto Rican dude who's not really afraid of much. I looked at him and said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "No, it's not. I'll tell you when we get in the car. I can't tell you now. I can't tell you until we get out of here." Now I'm a little freaked out. We pack the suitcases in the car and head out on our 3-hour trip to Albuquerque. I say to him, "What happened to you?" He tells me he was trying to fall asleep, and just as he drifted off, he awoke to someone whispering. He got up and looked out all the windows to see if anyone was outside. There was no one. He got back in bed and started to hear footsteps outside, and the whispers began to get louder and louder. He said they sounded like they were almost surrounding the trailer, swirling and wisping around like dry leaves on a fall day. Then the most terrifying part, he said, was when the footsteps began to move to the roof. Something was walking on the aluminum trailer's roof. He said he sat stiff as a board as this went on for the whole entire 2 hours I was asleep. As we were driving, it was pitch black, and I felt like something shifted in the air. The beautiful canyons we drove through just yesterday began to take on a new meaning. The night felt extra dark, and the energy just felt very wrong. I don't know if we were just extra jumpy, but cars would just appear out of nowhere behind us and then pass or disappear. At one point as we rounded a bend, we saw a huge elk standing proud on the side of the road. He didn't appear to be trying to cross the road, he just stood still, almost acting as a guardian to the canyons. He was king of majestic Lowell. I looked at the tank, and it was getting uncomfortably close to empty. A rookie mistake to think that we'll just get gas on the way to the airport applies the same way as it does back home. My BF starts freaking out. I tell him when we get closer to Santa Fe, we will see more open, functioning gas stations. As I said, the gas light comes on. As we get closer to Santa Fe, I realize I was wrong. Every station we saw was closed. Pumps turned off everything. I started to get nervous. Finally, after nearly 2 hours riding on empty, we see a station. I go into the store to get a coffee, I'm very groggy and wobbly but feel strange the moment I go inside. The counterwoman, who was native, looks shaken and appears to be watching me the entire time. I am getting coffee and trying to find the right size lid, and I see her watching me from the other side of the cups. When I turn my head, she looks the other way. Her body language was upset. I asked my BF if he had the same experience as I did when he came in to fix his coffee and pay for the gas. He said he did. Even stranger was that he saw an elder native man that was leaning against the counter, just silently watching him and his every move. He'd go to the coffee station, and the man would turn and watch. He said the elder man's body language appeared to be much calmer than the woman's. The thing is, I was very hypervigilant in the gas station, but I do not recall this man. My BF to this day swears the man was there just watching. He can't believe I never saw him. Anyways, we got to the airport, and the strangeness stopped as soon as we boarded the flight. The whole night seemed to be a long, strange fever dream. I just am looking for insights. I am fairly certain what we experienced was what I think it is. I am curious about the man in the gas station. I wonder if the man and the woman knew what was happening. The woods speak. When I was younger, in my single digits, I lived in a duplex with a spacious yard that bordered a set of woods. I used to like wandering said woods, and it was also a shortcut to our local armory. One day my friend and I decided to venture into the woods at night. We had some cheap flashlights for our only light, followed by the moon. We ventured past the armory exit trail, deeper into the woods. Now, mind you, past this point there weren't any houses. We continued to go deeper, not too sure what, if anything, we were looking for. Out of boredom, we decide to turn back and head home. As we turn, we hear, "So soon?" Slightly confused and intrigued, we answer back, "Yes, why should we stay?" After a brief period, silence falls upon us. So we continue on our way back to our homes. The friend suddenly feels a tug on his pant leg. He looks down and sees a disturbing upper body of a child. He says it was from the waist up, and it was reaching up, tugging on his pant leg. I don't really buy it at the time, but a bit freaked out, we then run back home. He tells me what he saw and demands the next day we go back and see if we can experience something else. The next day, later in the night, we head back to the woods, around the same spot we went the night prior. Instead of impatience, we decide to continue to wait. We begin to hear twigs snapping in the far distance of the woods. It sounds like something crawling toward us. A bit scared, we turn to where the noise is coming from, flash our lights in the direction, and now we both see the same thing, simply the upper body of a child around our ages. Stunned, we can't move and just watch this thing crawl closer to us until we hear his mom yell our names. At the time, we thought her voice shouting for us was scarier than what we saw. We were kids afraid of consequences, so we ran back home. Now, the best way to describe what we saw was an upper body, no legs or anything below the waist, scratched, tattered clothing, but the body looked fresh, with no rot or decay. It looked like a kid, maybe between 6 and 8. Unfortunately, the area we used to roam has been developed into townhouses and shit, so we may never know what it was. We can't pinpoint the exact year, but it was likely in the mid-90s, possibly in the late summer of 1995 or 1996. Location was Alliance, Ohio. A gnome-like creature in the forest. It was a school trip around 2 years ago, so I should have been 15 to 16. The place we were staying at was in a natural habitat, meaning only the resort staff and the nearby shop staff and the occasional students going camping lived there. The place was buried deep in the woods, and that nearby shop I mentioned? Yeah, it was 20 minutes away on foot. Through the forest. We were staying at the resort for 8 days, so it's only natural that 8 days in, we wanted some alcohol. We couldn't smuggle it in during the day because all the teachers constantly checked any student's backpack when he went off to the shop in the daytime and just took the booze and drank it themselves. My favorite damn teachers. Our group was 3 boys and girls, so it's only natural that I volunteered to go. So did a good friend of mine, we'll just call him Steve. We had to act as men anyway. It's 3 in the morning, the teachers are finally in their rooms, probably asleep, so Steve and I sneak out and venture out in the night. The already familiar path looked alien in the darkness. We were originally not going to use a flashlight in order to not get caught, but it got too goddamn dark before we were even in the forest. There it was. The hole in the metal fence that acted as a divider between the resort and the forest so that no animals could wander in. We untied it as we were shown, and we found ourselves in the forest. If you've ever been in a forest during the night, you'll know how scary it is. It's so dark that the phone flashlight can't illuminate the distance, so all you see when you look around are tree silhouettes, not what's behind them. And you constantly hear all these noises of something moving and can't even tell if it's something small like a frog or a goddamn coyote. I just now realized how non-thought through our plan was. We were in the forest, at night, with no weapons, kilometers away from the nearest town, so an ambulance wouldn't make it in time. We walk for what seems like an eternity and talk about the girls back in camp. I was looking around for the shop, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, as we were walking, the path led into a wooden fence. We were right next to the shop. But it was closed and abandoned. Goddamn, how stupid we were. We didn't even think that through, and that got us in some trouble later too. We sat down to discuss our plan B, but really, we were just buying time to pick our balls up and muster the courage to go back. There was way too much noise in the woods now, but I had gotten used to it so far. We started walking back and talked about how we'd go buy the alcohol during the day, hide it in the forest, and come back again at 3 a.m. to pick it up. And all of a sudden, right behind us, we hear something run out of the bushes behind us and pitter-patter on the road. The footsteps sounded exactly like some kind of wild dog ran out. I was so startled I literally jumped and turned around, screaming. I don't remember Steve's reaction. Right there, in the middle of the road, there was a real thing, a wild thing staring at us. I had a brief 2 seconds to look at it, and even though I hadn't brought my glasses, I had a good look. It was around waist high, with short limbs and legs. The silhouette looked exactly like you'd expect a dwarf from a fairy tale to look like. The light illuminated it for 1 second before my friend started running away, but all I saw was a silhouette. I can't say if it was naked or if it had some kind of clothing. I kind of saw something in its hand, possibly a weapon of some sort. It didn't say anything or make any sound. My friend started running away before me. If the thing was actually wild, then its predatory instinct kicked in, and it rushed towards me. That, dare I say, was shit freezing. The way it went from stationary staring to running towards me in small steps kept me awake for several nights even though I spent the last few partying. I was no longer frozen. I turned around and sprinted after my friend in such a frenzy that I passed him. We ran into the woods. We didn't care if we reached the resort, we just wanted to get out of that thing's reach. I remember how many thorny bushes there were to slow me down, but I didn't pay any attention to them. I just ran forward with my knees up to my face. We ran through the forest for around 5 minutes without stopping once or looking back, and eventually we got to the beach shore. A look to the left, shore. A look to the right, fallen rocks that blocked our way to the camp. I looked back, and it seemed that we lost the thing, or at least we had some time before it caught up. We quickly spurred out ideas of what we should do. I offered to fight back. We could throw sand in its eyes, if it even had any, and beat it up. There were 2 of us against a midget anyway, or we could go in the water, deep enough for it to drown if it chased after us. Looking back at it, if we stayed to fight, we'd probably freeze again, and if we went in the crazy water in the dark, we'd likely drown. My friend suggested trying to climb the rocks first, and if we couldn't, we would do it my way. Bingo. We actually were able to climb the rocks. They were drier than I thought, and we stayed for a minute to see if the thing was after us. I was thinking it all through, if it can reach us in anything, until I heard the familiar frequency of pitter-patter on the sand in front of us. I couldn't see the short demon because its size was hidden under the rocks, but it knew exactly where we went and went out of the forest and right to the rocks. I swear I heard it. I looked down at my feet, and under the rocks there was enough space for it to sneak under us and grab us in between the rocks. I remember I imagined that scene and instantly started running back. Steve was right behind me, and we were running on the dangerously slippery rocks, just shouting. Oh my god, did you see it? What the duck, man? It's real, man. What the duck? We eventually ran all the way back to the camp and snuck in the same way we did out. We secured our rooms to prevent the demon dwarf from following us into the resort. We then proceeded to the balconies, where I recounted the story to everyone. Meanwhile, my friend spent the rest of the night vigilantly watching out for the dwarf. Nothing has happened after that. Steve mentioned that he saw something that looked like the dwarf, but it was just some bush or something. Middle of nowhere, middle of the night. Growing up, I spent every summer vacation at my grandparents' house in rural Tennessee. When I say rural, I mean their town was literally a cluster of homes with a singular one-lane road as the only way in and out. The nearest freeway on-ramp is 45 minutes away, a grocery store is 30 minutes away, and a Sam's Club/Costco is an hour and a half away. My grandparents still live here and make that drive every month, but that's another story. I would play outside for hours and hours without seeing more than 2 or 3 cars. It's a lot more built up now, but it was lovely while it lasted. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I and my dad couldn't sleep because it was an especially hot and muggy night. We decided to go for a drive through the hilly, curvy backroads that I absolutely loved and still do. There was a scenic access site that was just a clearing overlooking a cliff about 15 minutes further into the woods from my grandparents' house. The location, a narrow 2-track with a couple of dilapidated trailers lining it roughly every 1/4 mile, wasn't very well known. Due to the isolation and lack of any real police presence, this area was lousy with meth during this time, and there was a local rumor of some inbred cult up in the woods. Keep in mind, it was midnight by the time we got to the parking lot for the overlook, which was just a gravel pit. My dad has always had a bit of an intuition and asked me if I really wanted to get out of the car. That made me hesitant myself, but I saw the amount of lightning bugs that were out, and catching them was my favorite pastime. Armed with a flashlight and an old Tupperware container with some holes drilled in it, we set off down the path to the cliff. We immediately heard noises in the woods, heavy footsteps. Way too heavy for a deer, and there wasn't really a bear presence in this area. The woods were unusually quiet besides that. We both thought we saw someone hide behind a tree out of the corner of our eyes, and I didn't realize he saw it too until we brought it up in the car, and vice versa. Here's where it gets freaky. Once we made it down the path to the cliff, we saw the outline of a man. He was about my dad's height, 5'10" inches. But he was as thin as a rail, he couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds. Here's the thing, he wasn't admiring the beautiful moonlit scenery over the cliff. He was standing perpendicular to it, just staring off into the trees, perfectly still. My dad slightly nudged me in the direction of our car. As I started walking back, he shined the flashlight on the man. As soon as the light shone on the man, my dad gasped and dropped the flashlight before literally picking me up and sprinting full force back to our car, and as we peeled out, I had no idea what the duck was going on. His face looked like a goddamn melted candle, he said after a few minutes of silence after we pulled out onto the main road. Apparently, the man had no nose, just 2 nostril holes in his face. His description suggested that he had suffered from burns. As we brought it up to my grandmother the next day at breakfast, she immediately turned pale. Apparently, there was a meth lab explosion up in the hills a few months prior, and they were unable to rebuild the building. So, they resorted to making their product in the woods and are very defensive, even homicidal, about their stash. I go dispersed camping quite far out. Not some campground or dispersed spot that's easily accessible. We're talking miles in the woods at times. Most of the time I go solo. But in any case, I've had some odd encounters, and it seems like it's happening post-pandemic, or I just don't recall odd encounters like this happening before. In any case, here are some odd encounters I've had, with my last week's camping trip, still bugging me. One out solo, I was camped out in a nice secluded area. Around 3 p.m., a family in a sedan of all things rolls up and asks if they could join me for camping because they had some extra food and want to share it with one person and one person only. I was a bit weirded out, but I just respectfully declined. They were kind of pushy, but I still said no. They ended up driving about 50 feet to a little car pullout and set up camp there. The thing was that they could clearly see me from where they parked. It just got uncomfortable since it felt like they were constantly watching my every move. It got to a point where I just threw all my stuff into the truck and left. Odd thing was, beyond them, I had to drive about 3 miles closer to the main Forest Service road to see another camper. 2 rolled into camp around 4 a.m., so I opted to knock out in the truck, which has 5% tint, and I also put up the sunshade on the front window. Around 7 a.m., my truck starts rocking back and forth. I've slept in windy conditions, but the rocking was jarring and just didn't feel right. On top of that, no sound of gusts. So I get up, and the next thing I see is a guy just standing on my side step and also peeking into the truck. Freaked out, I jump into the driver's seat, start the truck, and crack the window open to ask what he's doing, which freaks him out. The odd part is that he literally looked at me like I spoke to him in a foreign language, but even weirder was the fact that he was murmuring some language that I've never heard before. I quickly left the site. 3. This was with a group of friends. To put things into perspective, let me explain. We were around 3 miles from the nearest main fire road, 20 miles away from the nearest town, and camped out in a little valley where you can clearly see any light on the side of the valley. In any case, around 11 p.m., when we're sitting around a campfire, a guy just shows up from the darkness, no lights, and asks if he can have food. He didn't look homeless. Just a typical 40-year-old who looked decently groomed and in casual clothes. Like a guy you might see at Target. Anyways, we gave him food, he sat down, ate the food, said, "Thanks," and just walked off into the darkness with no lights. We even looked towards the direction he left in, but he just disappeared into the darkness. What was odd was that he just sat down quietly and then wouldn't say anything even when we tried chatting with him. 4. This was the most recent one, but around 1 a.m., I got woken up to some footsteps and what appeared to be 3 people, based on 3 sources of light, walking around my campsite. I freak out and get my Glock ready. One of them comes to the door and tries to find where the zipper for the door is, based on him lifting the little flap around the zipper line. As soon as he started unzipping the door, I said, "Hi, how can I help you?" The guy at the door screams and jumps back. From there, I unzip part of the door. One hand with a light in hand and the Glock in the other. They just said they were there making sure everything was okay. It was weird, but they left immediately after. A bit confused by the interaction, I just couldn't go back to sleep and stayed up until around 6 a.m. The whole time, I just sat in pitch darkness watching the night sky. More so just to take my mind off things, but also as a means to make sure they wouldn't return. The cult in the woods. I am an overweight guy, but I have been on a diet the last couple of months, along with a healthy exercise regime, gym and jogging, to get the weight off. Anyway, here is what this is all about. I go jogging a couple of nights a week in and around the forest/woods about a mile away from my home, North Wales, UK. I was out jogging in the woods, its genuine name, one night a few days ago. I stay off of the track most people would walk along and run my own set course, deep into the dense trees. I have run my course a fair few times without anything strange or unusual happening. On Wednesday, 22 of August, last week, I was out running just as it was going dark. On this particular night, the atmosphere in the woods felt strange. It felt lonely and cold, as there was nobody around. I started jogging through my trail, and all was well. The sun was setting, making it darker and darker. I decided to quicken the pace as it was getting a bit too dark for me. I just continued jogging with Biffy Clyro blaring through headphones. Then I had noticed the surroundings looked a bit unfamiliar to me. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, with my low visibility due to the darkness, and when you are jogging, you kind of go into a world of your own. If you jog or run, you will know what I mean. I stopped to look around and figure out my bearings. I had no clue which path I had taken or where I was. I decided the best idea would be to turn back and try to get onto my path, or at least somewhere I recognized. I took my earphones out whilst I was having a slight jog back to familiar ground. By this time it was pretty much pitch black under the canopy of the trees. A slight panic started as I was jogging fast to try and get to somewhere I knew. As I continued to look around, I saw a moving light that was lighting the sides of the trees and the above canopy. The light was quite far away at this point, and I couldn't see what the light source was. I thought this was a bit strange, so I stood still and peered over the nettles/tree branches to get a clearer look. As the light was coming closer, I heard a faint chanting noise coming from the same direction. As it got closer, still couldn't see what it was, the voices got louder. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood around a little longer to see what this was. As I was quite well hidden in the bushes, I felt safe enough to stay. As it got closer, I could eventually see what the light source was. It was a long stick, somewhere around 4 feet long with a ball of fire on the end, a bit like an old-fashioned torch type thing, with a hand, covered in black, sleeve covered in a loose-fitting black fabric. As the figure emerged enough so I could see him/her, they were dressed in full black robes with long hoods. Then, as the first person passed through the trees, more slowly came passing into sight. They were walking slowly while chanting in another language I have never heard before, not Welsh. Only one of them had the torch in their hand, the person at the front. As they got closer, I then realized if I ran away from them, they would have seen me, and I didn't want to run further into the middle of nowhere as I was already lost. I just crouched down into the bush/nettles as they passed by me. By this point, I could see their details close enough. There were about 15 to 20 of them, all walking in sync, chanting the same words. A few would chant something, then the others would chant different words in a reply kind of thing. As they were walking past me, I felt a horrible sensation I had never felt before. My heart was beating faster, everything felt as if it went colder, freezing cold. As they continued to walk on past me, I saw an insignia on the back of their robes. This then started me thinking about the Knights Templar, about whom my granddad told me stories years ago, and how they escaped to Scotland and Wales when they were disbanded. After they had passed me and were a distance away, I felt safe enough. I ran faster than I had run before. I was absolutely shattered, but I ran more and more. Eventually, after a while, I found where I was, and I walked, cautiously, home. It took me about 3 hours altogether to do a jog that usually takes me around an hour and 15 minutes. Some weird stuff happens in this world, and I believe I have witnessed something truly strange, scary, and disturbing. I have since changed my path, and I always go jogging in the day now. If anyone has witnessed anything like this, please let me know. Thanks. Strange feeling in Appalachia. I have always been an avid mountain person. When people say they go to the beach for vacation, I respect it, but I prefer the mountains 100%. Something about these old giants has always fascinated me, as if I just cannot avoid being drawn to them and being in awe when hiking on them. Over my short life, 21-year-old student, I consider that I have seen a fair amount of mountain ranges in Europe, from the Alps in Switzerland to the Pyrenees in Spain and from the Italian Dolomites to the Czech Stola Mountains. I have always hiked and camped outdoors a lot, with family and friends, but also by myself. Now I went to the United States for college, and I have always been tempted to do a part of the Appalachian Trail. From the pictures I saw on the internet, I always wanted to see them in person. And not going to lie, I must say that the enormous amount of scary stories of these mountains always attracted me a little bit as well. I am definitely not a person who likes scary movies or anything, but I enjoy reading fellow mountaineer experiences, and to be honest, I mostly just read stories about the to know how to prep myself for when I was going to do it. The scary stories just got my attention every now and a while. That being said, I decided to go this year and do a small part of the I went to do a small part between the borders of Tennessee and North Carolina, with Clingman's Dome being the icing on the cake. I was a little bit hesitant to go by myself, since I am not very familiar with both the geography as well as the wildlife in this part of the States. I wanted to go with a friend or my girlfriend, who is from North Carolina herself, but both my friend, from Germany, and my girlfriend declined because they had to work. I had spring break. So, I decided I just had to go by myself since I am graduating this year and will return back to Europe. I started at this place called Bryson City and walked along the Tuckasegee River until I reached the Nolan Creek trailhead. From there on, I just followed the trail until I would reach Clingman's Dome, and from Clingman's Dome, I would follow the for about a week. I had prepared well for this trip. I carried bear spray and pepper spray. I read some freaky stories about people in the and I also brought this hunting knife and axe, for wood. I had some canned food and lots of water, plus a water filter, and for the rest, just my tent and sleeping bag. So when I started walking away from Bryson City, and I saw the beautiful aura this mountain range had, I couldn't be happier. I had been wanting to do this since I had arrived here in the US, and I was finally doing it. I encountered some people on the Nolan Creek trailhead who were friendly, but I had made up my mind that I would be better off alone than with strangers. I reached Clingman's Dome the same day and went a little further before I would set up camp. It was beautiful. At night I slept a bit off the trail, with a small campfire while I had dinner, which I put out before I went to sleep. The first night went super well, as I also was exhausted from the hike to Clingman's Dome. The next 2 days were just as beautiful, and I saw lots of breathtaking views. The people on the I encountered were super polite as well. Then, on the third night, I feel like everything took a strange turn. I had set up my camp just as usual, around 160 feet from the trail. No one was camping close to me, or at least not that I was aware of. While getting dinner, I just had this super weird gut feeling that I was not alone there. I felt like someone was looking at me from behind a tree or something like that. I tried to just convince myself that I was having an amazing time, that I was safe, and that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went to sleep and put out the fire as usual. Then, before it was daylight again, I woke up. I woke up with this same gut feeling that, even though I was in my tent, someone was watching my tent from a distance. I did not hear a single bird, which was weird, because right before daylight is when they start chirping again. I only heard the wind and the leaves. It made me feel uncomfortable, a bit scared even. I didn't fall asleep again, and first thing in the morning, after having breakfast in my tent, I broke up camp and decided to continue my hike. During my hike, I encountered a few people, and again they were very nice, but I stuck to myself. While walking on this part of the trail by myself, I felt being observed again. I even had the feeling as if something or someone was following me. So every now and then, I would stop dead in my tracks in order to hear if it was real. Now obviously my mind could be playing tricks, but I would swear that I heard the steps stop a second after I had stopped. So according to me at that moment, someone was following me. I looked around me the whole time, and I never saw someone or something, which made it even weirder. After the long day of hiking, I made camp, this time closer to the trail than usual, because for some reason I thought it would be safer. I again had this gut feeling of being watched while having dinner outside my tent. So I decided to finish it up in my tent, and I went to the bathroom in a bottle because I did not want to go outside now. I tried to sleep by closing my eyes, but my mind just focused on hearing the whole time. And that is when I heard it for the first time. A knock, as if a branch was hitting a tree, or a small rock was getting thrown at a tree. Silence followed, for what seemed an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes. Then again, this time more clear. I was scared now and had no idea where to go since it was dark already. I put on my flashlight in the tent and made myself as big as I could so that my shadow outside the tent would look bigger because of the light. I don't know why this was my reasoning at the time. I just thought of bears, and I held my hunting knife in my hand. The silence had followed the second knock, but now I shouted to pierce the silence in the dark. First I shouted that whoever was joking around, I was armed, and I was not wanting to be pranked. I thought this would scare them off. It didn't. It was almost as if this person found it even more funny knowing I was pissed at them. I heard another knock, and immediately after, a knock on what I assumed to be the opposite side from my tent. So now I was guessing it was two people instead of one and that they liked to pull a prank on an innocent passerby. I tried to stay up as long as I could, but around 4 a.m. my eyes just gave up, and I dozed off. I woke up around 8 a.m. again with the light of the sun being my savior. I first tried to hear if whoever was pranking me was still knocking. I did not hear anything. I shouted again, stating that I was now going to exit my tent with my knife in my hand and that whoever had been joking around should make themselves known. I walked out of my tent, and I did not see anyone. I looked for tracks around my camp but could not immediately make something out of it. I decided to get the hell out of there. The next part of my week basically continued being the same. At night I'd hear some knocks from different directions, and occasionally, I heard what I would guess was a little bit of humming. It sounded as though someone was simply humming a melody. Now I never saw anyone except for the occasional hiker on the ad. So I cannot say I saw something weird, but I never shook off this weird gut feeling of being observed and followed during the rest of my hike on the ad. I have now returned and discussed this with my girlfriend. She says it was probably my mind playing tricks on me, and I am willing to believe her, because I never saw anything. But I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I am in that tent in the middle of nowhere and someone is watching me and knocking on a tree. And every time I wake up like this, the thought alone scares me. This happened about 15 years ago. So my buddies and I went fish camping at a pretty remote lake off of a 4x4 trail about 2 hours from home. There were 4 of us, all men, with me being the smallest at 195 pounds, important later. The camping spot has great fishing, as it has a nice deep spot with lots of trout right next to it, but the campground itself is rough. It is on the side of a steep hill with barely enough room for tents and a small fire ring. It is accessible by a rough, steep, winding 100-yard trail from where you park your 4x4 above the camp. We had a great day drinking beers and catching our limits on nice-sized trout. After it got dark, we made a small fire and just bullshitted the night away. It was a great time. Suddenly, there was someone shining a blinding light in our eyes from about 10 to 20 yards away. We didn't hear this person approach at all. This person announced themselves as the sheriff. One of my friends asked, "Are you our county's name, sheriff?" The stranger didn't respond to the question. Instead he shined a light in each of our faces, then said, "Have a good night," then walked off. We sat there dumbfounded, asking each other what the hell that was. After a minute or two, curiosity eventually got the better of me, so I lit up this person with my stupidly powerful flashlight. He was about 50 to 60 yards away at this point, right before a crest and bend of the trail, right before he was out of sight. We all saw it. It was just some dude in a flannel shirt and jeans. I exclaimed, "That's definitely not a sheriff." He must have heard me, as you could see him start moving quickly for a second before he was out of sight. A few moments later we heard an engine start, and that was that. Strange we didn't hear the vehicle earlier, but I attribute that to being drunk and loud. Now what makes this kind of scary? What if it weren't 4 big dudes he approached? What if it was a single person or a couple? What would he intend to do? Should we have chased after this person? Debatable. Should we have reported this to the actual sheriff's department? Absolutely, but sadly we never did. Watcher in the woods. The year I turned 14 was the last year I would be permitted to attend my favorite summer sleepaway camp, St. George's. The camp is located in Orkney Springs, Virginia, a sleepy little unincorporated community entirely centralized around the existence of the Orkney Springs Hotel, an old and notoriously haunted retreat destination favored by the community of the Episcopal Diocese. Built in the early 19th century and then restored in the 70s after ownership changed, there is, to this day, a stagnant quality of time in Orkney Springs, which contributed greatly to the mood of the camp. Everything has a frozen effect, antique relics from the hotel's early history on display behind velvet ropes, old southern recipes from the same line of Mumaw women pumping hearty fare out of the communal kitchen, and the same rusty, dangerous elevator, which campers were chastised to never play on, leading up to a haunted ballroom resplendent in 70s decor. The camp is also owned by the Episcopal Diocese, and so subsequently we shared in the timeless sights, sounds, and smells of that place, forever caught in a long ago decade. Being 15 is a fussy age, a little too old to enjoy macaroni art or tie-dye t-shirts or sing-alongs without that first hint of the self-conscious discomfort that comes with puberty. At 14 I was still content with these things, though they admittedly were already beginning to lose a little of their succor. As a camp senior, the option was given to me to pick one of 3 big 3-day wilderness excursions. The options included canoeing, hiking, or rock climbing. I chose canoeing, and with 10 campers and 3 counselors, we departed in a van with our boats for, what I assume now, was the south branch of the Potomac River. We would be crossing over into West Virginia at some point, though that was often the case. The joke goes at St. George's that you can pick blueberries in Virginia and take a pee in West Virginia all in the same 5 minutes. The first day out, we passed boats with rural hunters as our canoes dragged lazily through a reedy dip in the river. They were the kind of West Virginian hunters you see in horror films, with 3 teeth, overalls over bare skin, and big old bloodhounds piled in wet next to them in their busted canoes. They cracked piss beer out of styrofoam coolers and spoke in a dialect so thickly garbled that I doubt even the counselors knew what they were saying. I remember one counselor holding a map out in the boat ahead of us, attempting to ask questions. The second day back out on the water under the burning hot sun, the counselors told us we were lost. Naturally we were upset, but they reassured us that as long as we followed the river, eventually we would come out on the other end near something familiar. Looking back now as an adult, I realize how young these counselors must have actually been, and I still wonder at their training. The youngest might have been 17, the oldest in his early 20s. But I was 14 then, so I didn't think about any of those things. With little choice other than to just agree and keep rowing, we kept moving forward. That afternoon, we pulled up on an unknown pebbly bank in order to make camp. A recent flood had torn debris from the riverbanks and washed it up on the shore as far up and down as the eye could see. All along the edge of the clearing we found were natural teepee formations made of mangled tree trunks and wild, snarling branches. We dragged our canoes up the rocks to tuck them beside the trees, and I remember waves of tiny frogs fleeing in front of us in a green tide and one fat toad that flopped on my boot toe and wouldn't leave. Later, while hunting for a suitable girls' latrine spot, I went inside one of the natural teepees and discovered the bloody skeletons of poached raccoons hanging wetly above. The blood hadn't completely dried yet, and their tails were still intact, fluffy in the breeze. A snuffed-out fire pit was directly below, and I thought of the men with 3 teeth and their dogs in their boats. That night, we ate and sang camp songs, had s'mores, and looked at the stars. After dark, for a briefly frightening time, a certain moaning noise began to intermittently come out of the woods. Our counselors quickly rushed to reassure us that the sounds were from cows and that we must be camped on the very edge of a farmer's grazing property. We quickly accepted this and went to bed. The girls went to their tarp in one corner, yards away, the counselors slept in their tent, and the boys' tarp sat on the farthest side of our grounds. I woke up deep into the night with a mighty need to pee. I climbed out of the pile of snoring teenage girls, grabbed a flashlight and the bathroom kit, and ambled out into the trees to find the perfect spot. I don't remember being at all afraid in that particular moment, mostly interested in satisfying my bladder by emptying it. I was calm enough that when I encountered a strange figure a few minutes into my walk, I stopped, assuming it was one of my fellow campers. About 10 feet away from me, sitting on a broad, flat rock, was a young boy. He looked about my age, 14, maybe a weak 16. His head was buzzed, and his hair looked pale, maybe blonde. It was cold outside in a way that only mountains can be at night, and yet he wasn't wearing a shirt. He was a little cave-chested, and he sat with one elbow propped up on his knee, barefoot in tattered, acid-washed jeans. He was smiling just a little and looking directly at me. My first inclination was anger. I thought at first glance that this was Alex, one of the boys camping with us who worked picking corn with his father. I was about to tell him off for being a creep and watching girls pee in the dark when I started to realize that a few fundamental things about what I was looking at were wrong. This was not Alex. This was not Alex. This was not Alex. The boy's eyes flickered in the beam from my flashlight, like a deer or a cat's does when they cross headlight beams on the road. There was a gold fluorescence to it that human eyes can't produce. I remember standing there for some time, staring at him as my mind put the puzzle together. The length of time I stood there, staring, is the single detail I can attribute to knowing that this really happened to me. That this was real, when years later all I can think about is that science must have an answer to this. That the universe is so huge and that we know so little about things, but that I know that I saw this. Because I looked at him and he looked back at me, so directly, so incredibly aware of me and I of him, until I realized I could see the trees behind him, through his body. I could see through him, and he was smiling at me, and we were lost. There's a quality to fear when it becomes that incredibly intense, which makes you entirely lose your grasp of time. All I know is that I dropped everything in my hands. My toilet paper. My flashlight. And I ran away through the dark. And before I knew it, I was lost in the woods. I have no concept of how long I ran alone through the dark. I have never been this scared in my life, and I pray that I never will be again. Everything gets distorted. Time, breath, space, thought. I don't remember screaming either, but apparently I was. I screamed loud enough that a friend woke up and came to find me, popping up unexpectedly from behind a bush and scaring the shit out of me all over again. The one miracle I can attest to this is I never actually pissed my pants, though I think it would have been justified. Back at camp, I tried to wake up the girls. I cried and begged for them to listen to me, that I had just seen a ghost and we needed to get out of here because he was out there. Like really out there, like right over there out there. But trying to wake up a groggy 14-year-old girl after a vigorous day of physical work in the hot sun is like trying to push a boulder back up the side of a cliff. The ones that bothered to wake up enough to listen were angry, accusing me of causing trouble for no reason. And so I climbed back into my sleeping bag in the middle of the tarp, pulled the hood up, and didn't sleep. Instead I went on a silent, terrified night watch until pink kissed the sky and finally brought some relief. But before that, when I lay in my sleeping bag all the rest of that night, made worse by the tarp being completely open to the surrounding woods, I heard footsteps circling around us just behind the tree line. The constant crunch, crunch, crunch of 2 bare feet in the underbrush. The next morning, when I retold my story to anyone who would listen, a few shy girls told me that they too had heard footsteps in the woods. When the sun was at its morning brightest, after wrestling with myself about it, I finally returned to the rock I had found the boy sitting on. I stood on it and looked around at the ground. The dirt was scattered with rusting shotgun shells. That day we got back in our boats and followed the river back to familiar territory. I don't have any recollection of where this site was, or if I could indeed ever find it again, though I know I would never want to. The campers teased me and drew pictures of the ghost and laughed, and it became another camp story. The counselors markedly didn't say anything about it. Nothing. Not a single word. We made it back to camp safely on the 3rd day, and my story blended into the background of everything else about that place. I'm not religious, opting instead for hard scientific evidence to move my heart and thoughts. But this is a true story. I had an unexplainable incident happen to me while hunting several years back. This is certainly not your typical hunting story. I was new to the area and drew my first antelope tag in an area known as the Red Desert. I specifically scouted a remote location known as Bison Basin to hunt in. This area is probably one of the most remote areas in the lower 48 and a great area for antelope hunting, but all that is really out there is some oil and gas production and uranium mining ops. Long story short, I shot an antelope about 150 yards away from me and 200 yards from my truck. I walked out to where it dropped and filled out and attached my tag. That is when I looked up and noticed off in the distance on the horizon a bright light moving quickly, but it was hard to gauge the speed because it was probably a good 10 miles off in the distance. You can see for miles in all directions out there. One thing to note is that time and distance intervals are important to this story. With antelope meat, it is important to get the animal cooled off as quickly as possible, or else the meat can taste kind of funky. So I was in a rush to get the animal field dressed and back to my truck so I could pack the body cavity with ice. That being said, I tagged the buck, looked up, and saw the light on the horizon, thinking nothing of it, and I quickly went to work field dressing. In a matter of 30 to 45 seconds, I had opened up the body cavity and removed the guts, and that is when I glanced up and noticed about a mile away or less that the light that I had seen in the distance was approaching me with incredible speed. So in that 30 to 45 seconds, that light had covered a distance of what I estimate to have been 9 miles, and it was approaching me at this speed. I couldn't tell what I was looking at as the light was very bright and flying over the top of the sagebrush and making no sound. As the light got to within 200 yards of me after observing it for a few seconds, I could make out what it was. It was a rectangular shape of polished metal, about 5 feet tall by 2 to 3 feet wide, like a dressing mirror, and it was reflecting the setting sun, which was behind me back at me. The flying object then dropped down below the sage, and I couldn't see it anymore. Again, it made no sound, but it was close enough to me that I should have heard engine noise. I was spooked and shook. I wanted to get back to my truck and leave, but I had to take the animal. I bent over and hid below the sagebrush line and quickly finished field dressing and grabbed the leg and took off running/dragging the antelope back towards my truck. This all took a matter of 1 minute to 1.5 minutes before I was completely gassed, so I stopped and looked back to see if the light was anywhere to be seen, and I could now see the light blasting off in the opposite direction, again back 8 to 9 miles, going towards the horizon, moving faster than anything could possibly travel over that terrain. It was still reflecting the setting sun back at me. It eventually disappeared over the horizon after a couple of seconds, and I finished dragging the animal to the truck and GTFO. I don't know what I saw, but I know it was not a drone, SXS, or any kind of low-flying plane. I would have heard engine noise, and that terrain could not be covered at that speed by any kind of wheeled vehicle. I even went as far as to ask Fish and Game and the uranium miners if they ever operated any kind of drones that could perform like that, and they said no, but I know it wasn't a drone. I've never been back to that area since. My friends and I enjoy making mountain bike trails in the woods on a mountain near our houses. One day they couldn't go outside, so I brought my younger sister with me. I was also going to bring my little brother, who was going to be a little bit late since he was at a friend's house. This day was a little bit rainy, and it was cold. Nobody would be hiking the trails this day. They had never seen what I and my friends had been working on the past couple of months, so that day was the day to show them. Basically, you walk straight on. Once you reach a 90-degree turn in the trail, you should veer off to the right, circle around a bend, and discover an overgrown, abandoned forest road ahead. At the end of this forest road, we had a small trail that led to the bottom of our MTB trail. My sister and I waited for my little brother, but then my mom called me, telling me that my brother didn't know where to go, so I told my sister to go all the way back to wait for him outside the trail in the neighborhood. She never saw him since he decided he didn't know where to go, despite the clear instructions, since my mom then called me once more telling me he was back at home. Then I called my sister to tell her to come back up the trail, telling her very clearly, make sure nobody is following you. This wasn't for our safety, but so nobody would discover these trails I and my friends were building. But this time it was different. As my sister was walking up the trail, I could look from the side all the way across the forest road, where she was on her way up. Then I thought to myself, was she wearing a white jacket before? Then I realized that, as the figure got closer to the clearing, this was not my little sister. This was a grown man. Nobody would ever find this trail, and if they did, they would have no reason to come up here. Plus, the rain the past couple of days made most of the trail muddy. Extremely muddy. I started running down the trail and then behind a tree so I could call my sister to tell her to not go up the trail. Then I heard, "What are you doing?" It was my little sister. She had already made it all the way up and back to the trail. Then I knew what happened. This man followed my sister up the trail. I was terrified, and I could tell my sister started to pick up that I was serious. We waited around 10 minutes, but we couldn't see the person anymore. There was no way to go but up the trail toward us, unless this person hid in the trees off the forest road. We swiftly and silently made our way back. I sensed someone watching me. We made it to our bikes, which were thankfully still there. I told my sister to pick up her bike so we could walk through the rest of the trail without the noise of our hub clicking. This way we could hear everything going on around us. At the trail's entrance, where it's easier to see footprints, I noticed a set of large boot prints next to my sister's smaller ones, indicating they were more recent. That confirmed I was 100% not going insane. I ensured our safety by riding bikes to the neighborhood. Luckily we made it back home. We told our parents, who were glad I was out there as well. All I could think was, what if I wasn't there? What would have happened to my sister? Minnesota Wood Wizards. The following story is true, as told to the author. The caller wished not to be identified by name, so fictional names are used. By Ken Korchak. The rugged gravel road that winds like a serpent through the thick forests of Minnesota's northwest angle seems especially lonely when you travel it by night in a rattling old pickup truck. That's what Duke Rialto was doing one humid summer night in August of 1991. He was headed for a cabin at the Northwest Angle Resort in Angle Inlet, where he was supposed to join his buddies, who had arrived ahead of him for a week of fishing. It was after midnight, and Duke was dead tired. He had started out early in the morning from Esther, Iowa, and had driven all day to reach the wilds of the northern peak of Minnesota, the Angle. But now, after hundreds of miles, Duke's 65 GM decided it had enough. A sudden loud clunking noise erupted underneath, and the old pickup lost momentum fast. I don't care who you are, it's a scary feeling to have your truck go dead at night in the middle of the mysterious wilderness of the Northwest Angle. Duke had driven this road before and had often seen large bears, moose, and other varieties of ferocious beasts prowling the edge of the forest. Now he was faced with walking along this wild road in the inky blackness of night with God only knows what manner of furry brute waiting in the dark to jump out at any warm meal walking by. Duke pounded the steering wheel and cursed his old GM, but all the foul language in the world can't fix a blown-you joint. He thought about waiting for someone else to come by, but anyone who has driven the Angle Road knows that the chances of another car coming by late at night are next to none. Cursing his luck, Duke reached into his cubby for a flashlight and a .22 caliber pistol, which probably hadn't been fired in 5 years. The thought of shooting at something in total darkness made him even more nervous. Then suddenly, Duke's luck seemed to change. As soon as he switched off his headlights, he noticed a faint yellow glow coming from deep in the woods on the east side of the road. A cabin, he thought. He got out of his pickup and walked toward the light. When he reached the edge of the forest, he could see that the light was a considerable way into the woods, but it was difficult to tell how far. It was also hard to tell what the light was. It might have been a cabin window, or maybe a campfire. Reluctantly, Duke stepped into the woods, keeping his eyes on the yellow glow. He told me. To be honest, I was terrified. I was shaking. I mean, there I was out in the black woods with a dim flashlight in one hand and an old pistol in the other. I kept thinking I'd run into a bear. But the worst, I think, is what your own imagination projects out into the dark unknown. The woods were wet with dew. The pungent smell of rotting leaves and old wood hung in the air, as did patches of mist drifting up from the forest floor. Branches tore at Duke's clothing and slapped his face as he moved along. He stumbled often and cursed every time. All the while, he was filled with fearful uncertainty. He had no idea what the light was, his heart pounded and his mind raced with wild ideas. Maybe it was a UFO. Maybe some murderous lunatic hiding out in a shack. But as he got closer, Duke began to sense that what he was approaching was stranger than anything he imagined. About 20 yards away, Duke made out the shape of 3 men standing around some kind of large light. In Duke's words, "It definitely wasn't a campfire," Duke said. "I'm sure of that. It didn't flicker like a campfire. It was a steady glow. It was like a large globe on the ground. And those men were just standing around it, stiff-like. They just didn't seem right. You usually sit around a campfire, but these guys were stiff and just strange, somehow. Their body language was off-kilter, not natural." Despite his fear, Duke called out to the men. Hearing the shout, the 3 shadowy figures jerked, turned, and stood rigidly. Then, according to Duke, something bizarre happened. The light they were standing around transformed instantly into a campfire. I mean, I didn't see it directly, but one minute it was a steady, glowing light, and the next it was a flickering, cracking, smoking campfire. Not sure what to think, and without options, Duke approached the men, squeezing his pistol hard in his sweaty palm, hiding it behind his back. When he got closer, the weirdness got weirder. They were ordinary-looking men, I suppose, but the way they were dressed was very odd, Duke said. I mean, one of the guys was wearing a cape. How often do you see anyone in northern Minnesota wearing a cape out in the woods? The man with the cape also sported a thick purple shirt with no buttons and matching purple pants. He was wearing tall leather boots. His face and hair seemed normal. His cape was clasped at the shoulder with a magnificent gold ornament that glinted in the firelight. The second man was wearing pants that were like knickers, Duke said, and were bunched up like riding pants. The man in the riding pants had a shiny bald head, and he wore a loose black sweater tucked into his knickers, which were tight around the waist. He was wearing what Duke called thin street shoes. The third man wore a long gray cloak that covered most of his body, but he could also see that he wore purple pants and high leather boots. He had long brown hair and a heavy mustache. They had no vehicle that he could see, and no camping equipment, no tents, not even anything to make a fire with, like an axe, nothing. At first, the 3 men stared at Duke as if he were some kind of circus freak, but then they seemed to quickly recover and tried to act normal. They tried to act normal, Duke said, but it didn't take a rocket scientist to see that these guys weren't from around here. Either that, or they were playing some kind of weird game. I just don't know. Duke stepped up to the fire and said hello and started to explain that his pickup had broken down on the road. The man with the bald head stepped up to him, smiled broadly, and said in stiff English, "You have lathed your feet and joined us here to be happy." All 3. I just didn't know what to think about what he said, Duke said. It was a weird statement. I thought maybe these guys were Russians or some kind of foreigners or something that were trying to enter the United States illegally through Canada and the woods of the Angle or something. I don't know. It just didn't make much sense. Then the guy with the cape moved forward and pushed the bald guy aside. He asked, "The Eon? Is it of, sir?" Duke said, "I'm not sure what you mean. What do you mean by Eon?" The 3 strangers all gave each other knowing looks, as if they were all part of some kind of conspiracy. Then the caped man said, "You more to say?" "We hear more to say." At this point, Duke was more certain he was talking to some kind of foreign smugglers, although he could not fathom their accents. They didn't sound Russian or like any other foreign accents he was familiar with. They sounded like people speaking a strange form of true English. Duke said, "I talked to them some more, but it was extremely awkward. I mean, they were nice and everything, but nothing they said made any sense. They were speaking English, but it was all mixed up, like they were putting together words from a dictionary without really knowing what each word meant in proper context. There was nothing to do but take his leave. Duke said goodbye to the three strangers, and the man in the cape said, for positive, yes. So Duke made his way back through the woods and found the road again. He spent the next 2 hours tramping along in the dark, walking, he figures, at least 10 or 12 miles, finally gaining Angle Inlet without getting eaten by a bear. After I showed up, I told my buddies about the strange guys in the woods, and they teased the hell out of me, saying I was drunk or high or loony or something. I eventually just stopped talking about it. I don't like to even bring the subject up anymore because nobody really takes me seriously. But it's one of those things you just don't forget about. It's like an experience that was on the edge of being paranormal, yet there could be a logical explanation for it. One last thing, after a week of fishing, Duke repaired his pickup, and he returned to Esther, Iowa. One of the words the bald man had said was eon, and it kept running through his mind. He looked it up one day in the dictionary and discovered that eon was another form of the word eon, which means an indefinitely long period of time, an age. Duke said, why would he be asking me what eon it was? Were they time travelers? Lost time travelers? They were certainly dressed like nobody I had seen before. Sometimes I think they were from another time. Maybe they were wizards. But then I think, nah, they must have been smugglers, maybe from some obscure place like Transylvania or something. I just don't know, but I'll always wonder about it. Eerily enchanting voice from the woods nearly convinced me. Having had a fair share of unexplainable paranormal experiences, this one stands out quite a bit, as a disembodied voice, for some reason, scared me a lot more than any physical being I've encountered yet, and still gives me the heebie-jeebies to this day, although at least now I can laugh it off and chalk it up to being a reckless drunk teenager. For context, my friends and I were pretty used to spending weeks on end unattended, mostly runaways. This was about 2005. Some parents and neighbors checked up on us, but most kind of knew it was better to let us get it out of our systems, I guess, but the danger is always still there with a house full of drunk teens, lol. Anyways, after a particularly wild house party, we cleared the house out, locked the doors and windows, did some light cleaning as much as we could, and went to bed. I was the last one awake, checking and double-checking the doors, and finally I crawled to the top bunk and tried to sleep. As I recall, it was around Christmas time, snow on the ground, pretty chilly, but normal for the area. The window I was sleeping near had been cracked from the changing weather, and a slight breeze came in, which I enjoyed, part of the reason I chose the top bunk. There was a cardboard piece on the window to prevent the real chill from coming in, so it was pleasant enough. I had been drifting off, enjoying the gentle cold of the window, when I started hearing a soft voice, like one whispering down a long hallway. It sounded mumbled at first, and in my stupor I didn't react or care at first, until it cleared up and I thought to myself, what if someone's outside when they shouldn't be? I tried to turn to the window but couldn't, too relaxed or drunk. I don't know, I've only ever experienced sleep paralysis once, and that's a whole other story. The voice became clearer when I realized I really couldn't move. And it was calling my name. Beckoning me, urging me to join it, to jump out of the broken window and run to it, to be with it at once, all the while growing in volume until it was nearly screaming in my ears as if it were in the bed next to me. Now this is just paraphrasing, I can't fully recall the words, but the feeling, oh, that feeling when it said my name. It's like I needed to be with it at once. As much as I knew it was dangerous and a bad idea, I can remember that feeling, that need. I was so willing to do anything in that moment to follow what it was saying. I could already see myself jumping out the broken window from 2 stories and running through the woods in the snow shoeless and bleeding, most likely to a horrible death, but I snapped out of it. Someone was pounding on the front door. It sounded like they were trying to break in. I tried to get up quickly, but by the time I got myself together, the bedroom door flew open, and my uncle was there, pale and eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost. He asked where his daughter was. She was safe on the bottom bunk. He explained that he had a bad feeling about us knowing how we like to party. He didn't mention if he had seen anything as he drove up. I kind of think he did. It was pretty well known to see odd things at that house and in the immediate area. I told everyone when they woke up. I didn't mention much after that. I still think of it sometimes, wondering what could have happened if I had gone, wondering what it was. I will never go back there again. Before my best friends and I were separated, one passed away, the other moved away. We used to ride around doing all of the haunted legend places within reasonable driving distances. Sometimes we'd drive a few hours, but most of them weren't scary, other than the adrenaline-filled, hyped up, did you hear/see that? That would cause us to get spooked. This one was different. Way different. We were just out of high school, probably 20 at most, and we were looking for an actually scary place to visit. A lot of the people we knew we were into these kinds of things, so we'd always get tips on where to go. There were the original 3 of us that day, and another friend that wanted to tag along. After a little drive to our destination, about 45 minutes, we stopped at a Wawa to get gas and grab a few snacks. Like I stated earlier, we were all about 20 at the time, so we were all hyped up because we knew spooky time was getting close. We'd always pick on that other friend that tagged along, nothing harsh, just you're scared. So I believe it was me that said something along those lines that was overheard by a few people. It got the attention of a few people in the Wawa, including these 2 creepy older guys, who seemed like they didn't fit in. Their clothes were all beat up and dirty, and they just didn't seem right for the area, and the time it was, probably 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. "What's the little one scared of?" asked one of the guys. I say little because the 3 of us are all abnormally tall. The shortest between us 3 was 6 feet 4 inches, and he was normal height, probably about 5 feet 9 inches. We replied and explained how we got tipped to go to this road because it's haunted. They replied that it wasn't that scary, and if we wanted a real scare, we should go to this random road. I forget what it was called exactly. But apparently there's this random memorial statue for a plane crash in the middle of the woods that crazy things are supposed to happen at. We grabbed our stuff and didn't think anything of it. As soon as we left, the group started talking and decided to go with the other road that those guys hyped up. I know, a typical horror movie what not to do. So we get to the entrance of the road, and it already did not disappoint. Woods on both sides, not one damn streetlight in sight. And I remember there was like a detention center off to the right. In the middle of nowhere. So the spooks already began the second we hit the entrance. We decided to drive down the road and search for the statue. We noticed that there were trees cut down on the side of the road, lying parallel to the shoulder of the road. We finally find the statue. About 5 minutes go by in silence, and we decided to enhance the scare factor by shutting the lights off. About a minute goes by, and we see a shadow figure pop out from the statue. We all freak out as it starts walking towards us, but it was making movements that no human would be normally capable of. It was dark out. But this thing was black. It was darker than the woodsy sky, so we could make out some of it. This thing was huge. Like I said earlier, we were all enormous compared to the average guy, but this thing would have dwarfed any of us. We decide to peel out of there and continue down the road, figuring it would lead us out of there. Boy, were we wrong. About 3 minutes go by, and we hit a dead end, which in this case was an open spot in the woods with sand everywhere. The cutout was massive but surrounded by woods. There were different cutouts and ways to go from there, and I'm pretty sure the road continued after this cutout, but we were quite deep in the woods at this point. So we decide to turn around there and obviously leave. After we turn around, we stop just to take in the eerie feeling. The other 3 guys were talking about the shadow we saw earlier, while I happened to catch something out of the corner of my eye. About 40 feet away from me, I see what appears to be a white face, and then another, and another. All surrounding the car. The other guys didn't see them, and I rarely ever get scared, but seeing me panic, they knew something was up. My panic caused them to panic. All panicking now. We then floor it far away from the sand turnaround. We get about half a mile down the road, somewhat near the statue, and pull over to gather our composure and get out of there. When we stopped, I swear I heard the typical ghost noise. This was now turning into a movie I wish I had never been a part of. So we are really scared now. After finding the way we came, we started heading back out. Remember those trees I talked about earlier? They were now lying in the middle of the road, blocking us in. As we all see the white faces, masks, that I saw earlier. Thank God my one friend, the driver, was good at driving and valued safety over his car. We drove on the edge of the woods, what felt like we were defying gravity to speed our way out. The car was literally sideways, on the edge of the woods. I could just stick a single finger out the window and touch the trees. We all made it home safely that night. After doing research, we found out that the spot was notorious in that area for crazy things happening, such as body dumps and murders. Because of the shadow and the ghost noise we heard, my head, heart, and gut tell me that that place is actually haunted. As previously stated, that place is famous for dumping bodies, along with a plane crash 100 years ago, so there are bound to be some spirits there. I think where we were that night was actually haunted. We just happened to be there on a night where there were more things going on. I can't help but think that the evil-looking shadow from the statue was actually an angel in disguise trying to scare us away from the doom that was upon us. I can't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure we survived one of their setups that night. But what I'm 100% sure of is that I will never go back again. I got chills just typing this, and I never tell this story. There were 4 of us there, one took our story to the grave, and I'm sure the rest of us won't speak much about it either. Whenever we even bring it up in front of people, we always use the code the horror movie that wasn't so that we don't have to actually talk about it. Thanks for listening, feel free to ask questions. Possible haunted ritual house in the woods behind our farm. This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years, but with Halloween coming up, it's been on my mind again. I myself have never been able to witness the house, though the description I've been given by multiple men 20-something years after seeing it gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I would like to mention that my father is a highly religious man, a preacher's son, and does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the sh out of him even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 80s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the waterfall/creek bed behind our farm and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night they decided to take a different route to go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly after leaving the area and continuing into the woods, at night of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon what is described by all 5 men, 20 years later, as a Blair Witch look-alike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling, but of course they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange Latin-like languages with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a soul to some, supposedly demonic, deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood while others were clearly spray paint, and I find it easier to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened and had a lot of experience with having to see human blood and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living/kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up, and the stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, then turned right, so as you started up, you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs a door led to a large attic-styled bedroom where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols, graffiti, and now more obvious and frightening large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly, but when they looked back, there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood, and now completely spooked, they rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating, but when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left, but here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and, for some unknown reason, decided to try walking back from a different route, using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction, yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hand and still do to this day. The final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they began to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and finally decided that it was time to give up when one of them nearly fainted, and as they turned to leave, the man who nearly fainted turned, looked up, and pointed at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall female figure hunched over, standing in the window watching them, though they see no features on her face other than 2 large, dark-colored eyes, and it sort of shuffles in place slightly before turning and walking away as if it were heading to the stairs at the end of the room. At the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate about 3 miles from my dad's house, where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way, and my dad's cousin gets up to get some water from the kitchen only to announce that he swore that he saw the same figure standing outside of the kitchen window near the edge of the woods, close to the woodshed. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject is brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia or pareidolia, though 5 years later they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself, but with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Could it be possible that they were just spooked, and it caused them to see things? There are more details and descriptions that were left out just so it wouldn't be even longer than necessary. The most horrifying camp with my friends. It was October 29, 2024, and we were all 15. About 2 weeks before, I had organized a Halloween meetup with my 3 childhood friends at my house, which is pretty isolated, set far away from the city and near some empty farms. It's been a tradition every year to invite my friends over to camp out in a tent outside my house, but this time, I wanted to add some extra excitement. For privacy, I'll call my friends Ray, G, and Adam. Ray was the funny, tall, and average-built one. G was shorter but super chill, the kind of friend you could always relax with. Adam was my best childhood friend. We'd hung out almost every day each summer since we were 10 and had been in the same class for 6 straight years. They planned to arrive around 2 p.m., and we aimed to head out to our camp area by 4 p.m. Ray and Adam arrived first, so we set up snacks, packed our backpacks, and just joked around like any other 15-year-olds. We planned to get to the camp area using a couple of motorized bicycles and my dirt bike. I had my dirt bike, Adam had his own motorized bicycle, and I also had a second bike that Ray could use. But soon we realized that Adam's bike had a busted clutch cable. We spent a while trying to fix it, but we only made things worse. By the time G showed up at 3:30, we had to adjust our plan. We decided that I'd take G on the dirt bike, Adam would ride my other bike, and Ray would wait back at my house while I made a return trip to pick him up once we got the others set up at the camp. The camp area was about 8 kilometers away, requiring us to cross a quiet highway and then follow a bumpy, gravelly farm road. This camp area wasn't anything official, just a flat spot in the middle of a field where I liked to go to chill and clear my thoughts. By the time G and I arrived, it was already getting dark, so I rushed back to get Ray. When we finally all gathered at the spot, G and Adam had already set up the firewood but hadn't lit the fire yet. It was pitch black, and the place felt eerier than usual. We got the fire going and started grilling sausages, enjoying the solitude. The area is always empty, no one ever uses that road. Then, out of nowhere, we saw a helicopter fly over us. We laughed nervously, wondering if they'd spotted the fire and thought it was some sort of cult gathering. About 3 minutes later, we saw car headlights off in the distance, maybe 2 kilometers away. The car seemed to just be sitting there, with its lights on, but after a few moments, it turned them off. We thought it was weird but didn't give it too much thought. Then we noticed a massive tractor, one of those with crop-cutting blades in front, slowly moving through a field about 200 meters away. We didn't think anything of it at first, but then it started heading straight toward us. We quickly moved our bikes and bags out of the way, but the tractor kept getting closer, like it had no intention of stopping. At the last second, I grabbed our helmets and moved them just before the tractor rolled over the fire, extinguishing it. Then, it stopped right there, turned off its lights, and just stood still. It was pitch dark, and we couldn't see inside the cab. We all stood there, creeped out, wondering why it would almost run us over and then just stop. The tractor stayed in place for what felt like an eternity. None of us could see a thing inside, and the thought that someone was just sitting there, silently watching us, gave us chills. Finally, I told everyone to pack up as fast as possible. 2 of my friends somehow squeezed onto the back of my dirt bike, and Adam got onto the motorized bike. We sped off, with one of my friends clinging on and nervously looking back. He said the tractor was still just sitting there in the dark, without its lights on, as we got about 100 meters away. After a tense, silent ride, we finally made it back home about 20 minutes later. We tried to brush it off, only mentioning it once, but the whole experience left us shaken. Now, Thinking back, I can't help but wonder what the driver's intentions were. Why would someone drive so close to us, extinguish our fire, then just sit there in silence? I keep imagining that while we were staring into that dark cab, maybe the driver had already slipped out of the tractor, silently watching us from behind one of the wheels, hidden in the shadows just a few steps away, for those straight 5 minutes. The thought still sends chills down my spine. Stalked by a female solo camper for several days while on our mountain camping honeymoon. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just married my longtime girlfriend. Over the course of our 12-year relationship, we traveled to the mountains several times in both summer and winter, not only to camp but also to stay in nice mountain hotels and snowboard the slopes. Naturally, we both agreed this was how we wanted to spend the first few weeks of our marriage. We booked a 20-day stay at a mountainside campground on the other side of the country. We also decided to bring our dogs with us, as they too love being outdoors, and we generally bring them camping anyway. After 2 days of road tripping, we had arrived, quickly set up, and settled in for a good long stay on the mountain. It was beautiful. A couple of days into our trip, and we had already met a bunch of fellow campers. We are very experienced campers, so we generally attract a lot of attention from novice campers asking for tools or supplies as they see we are well set up. We are usually more than happy to help people get situated if they need matches, cream or sugar, or help setting up their equipment. It was day 4 or 5 when she first made her presence known to us. I will refer to this person as she or her as we never learned her name. We were sitting down under the shade of the large pine tree at the edge of our site, drinking beers and playing cards when she seemingly appeared out of nowhere. She was just suddenly right there. "Can I pet your dog?" she said. Even my dogs didn't see her approach as the very sound of her voice triggered them into a startled frenzy. As the dogs were worked up already, I politely told her no. Then she just stood there, at the edge of our site. She didn't utter a single word. Just stood there, sort of existing but not really doing anything. She wasn't exactly staring at us or looking at anything in particular. I asked her if she needed anything, and she said no. After a few minutes she walked off. I work with people with brain injuries, so I've had my fair share of experiences with unusual behaviors, including people with poor social skills, so I wasn't about to write this person off as creepy just yet, but she had my attention. I casually watched her walk off and enter a campsite across the path and a few sites down from ours. There was already a small tent set up in the site, but she proceeded to pull an even smaller single-person tent from her backpack and began setting it up. The day prior we saw 2 young girls set up the other tent and were clearly the occupants of the site. There was no further interaction with her that day, although we did notice that the owners of the other tent on the site were not around at all that day, and we didn't see them return that night. Well, the next morning I am walking to the camp showers to clean up for the day. As I walk past her site, I see she is sitting in her little tent reading a book. The door to the tent is open. I pay no attention and keep on my way to take my shower. When I'm done with my shower and walking back, I notice her tent is now closed, but it's jiggling about, so I know someone is in there. Then she made her presence known in a big way. Just as I am approaching her site on the way to mine, she unzips her tent, and I immediately see that she is completely nude. She then positions herself just inside the tent at the door and lets out this over-the-top full-body stretch and holds her arms way up to the sky while pushing her chest forward like it was some kind of mating ritual designed just for me. While she does this, she lets out what I only describe as an exotic moan. It was pretty obvious she was putting on a show for me. I continue on my way to my site and tell my wife about the display I had just been witness to. We both laughed it off and moved on with our plans to day hike a good trail to a waterfall. The trailhead for this hike was accessible from the campgrounds, so we didn't have to drive to get there. We just walked the additional 2 kilometers to the trail. We walked at a good pace, so when we got to the trail, we decided to stop for a few minutes and take some photos of the surrounding mountains before heading into the thicker bush. After sitting there for maybe 5 minutes while my wife is taking pictures, she emerges from the trail that leads toward the campground. At first I thought, okay, coincidence, she's staying here and this is a pretty common trail. But then she sees that I see her, and she stops dead in her tracks and just stands there. Same demeanor as our first encounter. Just standing, not doing anything in particular but also sending creep vibes our way. This was the first time I said to my wife, I think we have a stalker. Confused, my wife then looks to where I'm looking and is immediately a little creeped out. Once again I think, whatever, maybe she's just hiking the trail, no big deal. So we continue on the trail at a good pace, and she maintains a consistent distance behind us. Our dogs at this point are a little distracted by her, and our youngest dog keeps turning around to watch her. I got a little fed up with the dog constantly stopping to look back, so I decided we would stop for some water and let this woman pass. Well, What does she do but ducking stop walking when we stop and once again just stand there? Okay, so now we are genuinely concerned because this is approaching horror/suspense movie creep level, and I start to wonder what this girl's intentions are. Standing motionless at that distance and refusing to pass us just ramped up the oh shit factor to about 9. So my wife and I agree to just give it and cut the hike short by taking the shorter loop, which was only another half kilometer ahead, and head back to our camp. We managed to get some distance between us by jogging every time we would make a turn and she was out of sight. We didn't see her again until later that night. That night my wife decided to take an evening shower at the camp showers. When she returned to our camp, she told me our stalker was in the bathroom, also taking a shower. This time, however, she was with 2 other girls and appeared to be getting ready for a night at the club. There is a nearby ski town that has a few nightclubs and bars, so it was reasonable to see the girls getting ready for a night out. The 2 girls she was with were the 2 we saw previously set up at her site. My wife explains that she quickly picked up on the fact that the 2 girls and our stalker friend were not well known to each other. It was clear that the 2 girls were close friends with plans to go out partying, and our stalker was attempting to be friends and sort of invited herself to join them in their night out. Now we know the ski town well, and the girls kept reinforcing that they were meeting at a specific restaurant before going to the bar. It was currently 10:30 p.m., and we know the restaurant they were telling her to go to was closed at 10 p.m. They were lying to her about their plans. The stalker kept asking them too, "Are you sure this place is it? Are you sure?" They convinced her, and she then left the tent to finish getting ready while the 2 friends stayed in the bathroom to finish their makeup. My wife went on to explain how after she left, the 2 friends were mocking and making fun of our stalker. They were young 20-somethings acting like little girls in elementary school. My wife has no time for that, creepy stalker or not, she had to say something to the girls about their behavior. My wife calls them out on their behavior. Well, putting all the catty bitch bullying aside, the girls explained to my wife that the stalker girl had set up her tent on their site when they were staying with a friend in the ski town. When they returned, they found her living at their site without invitation. She had just taken it upon herself to take a little corner of their site without knowing them at all. The girls said they were upset with her and trying to make her feel uncomfortable so she would leave, but she wouldn't leave. Of course my wife asked them why they didn't just report her to the park warden. The excuse they gave was they were leaving the next day and didn't want to make a huge deal out of it. So whatever happened between them and the fake late dinner plans and clubbing is unknown to us. That same night, at 3 a.m., a blood-curdling scream awoke us all, right outside our camper. At first I was like, holy shit, that must be a wild animal. My wife is trembling, dogs barking, and I am startled but curious. I peel back the window cover to see her, standing motionless on the path outside our trailer. I had the window cover down maybe 8 to 10 centimeters when she appeared to make direct eye contact with me. My heart is racing. What is going on? After gazing in my general direction for what seemed like an eternity, she calmly turns around and walks to her tent. I go make sure our trailer is locked. After a good hour and a stiff whiskey, we manage to get back to sleep. So the next day, which is a Friday, we have friends from a nearby major city coming up the mountains to spend the weekend with us. We haven't seen them in a while, so we are excited for a couple of days together. Well, they are not at our site for 15 minutes, and as they are setting up their tent, she mysteriously appears out of nowhere yet again. Like bam, there she is, but now this time she is actually in our site. I hadn't had a chance to tell our friends about her before she arrived, so they were a little more friendly than I was. She asks me once again if she can pet my dog, who during all of this is barking at her. I think I said something like, "She isn't being very friendly toward you right now, so I would prefer if you didn't." She didn't pet my dog, but she also just stood there staring at me like she was considering how she would dismember my limbs. She then notices our friend's tent brand as he is still setting it up and comments on how it's the same model as hers, although with a larger sleeping capacity. My buddy has picked up on the creep vibes and my general displeasure with her presence, so he just gives her the, "Oh yeah, cool," and keeps setting it up. Well, she starts grabbing at the tent pegs and picks up the hammer and says she will help him set it up because she has experience with it. My buddy declines and asks for his tools back. Cue the ducking psychopath stare down, but this time she has a hammer in hand, adding to the oh shit factor. She literally just drops everything right there and runs off. I go on to explain the last few days to our friends, and they agree we need to keep an eye on her. So by this time the 2 girlfriends whose site she had hijacked were packed up and gone. It's now Friday night, and we've been drinking all day, so we're feeling pretty good. It's maybe about 11 p.m. when she walks over to our site again. She says, "Hey, you guys seem to have a lot of extra room with the tent and the camper. Do you think I could stay with you guys tonight? We could have a lot of fun in there together." My buddy is feeling pretty good from all the day beers, so he's pretty forward when he replies, "Did you just propose a gangbang to us?" Now this whole time I'm just sitting in my camp chair with my whiskey, taking this all in. She wasn't really noticing me at all so far. Then, she smiles, turns her head, and looks directly down at me and says, "I like your friend." She then turns around and walks away into the darkness of the night towards the forest. What the duck? We are all now terrified she is going to return. I decided right then and there if we see her again in a creepy fashion, I am calling the park warden. This is getting silly. Well, the night is winding down, so we all decide to walk together to the bathrooms to clean up for bed. My wife pulls on my hoodie and says, "Babe, look." I look over to see that the site she was set up on is completely destroyed. Shit everywhere. There's nothing but debris, trash, clothes, and food. Everywhere. I thought, okay, this is weird, could this have been a bear? No, we would have heard it. I then noticed that the tent is gone. She is gone and left the site a complete mess. As luck would have it, the park patrol was completing their fire rounds and were at the messed up site when we were returning from the bathrooms. We told them there was a girl staying on her who was acting erratic and we suspected she was squatting on the site based on our conversation with the two girls from earlier in the week. We didn't see her again for the rest of our trip until the last full day. There is a great little lookout point not far from our site that has amazing views of the river and valley below, and it was a perfect evening to see the sunset behind the mountains. It was a lovely final send-off to an otherwise beautiful honeymoon. Just when we thought we were done with her, she emerged once again from seemingly nowhere. We were sitting on a couple of chairs that are bolted in place at the viewpoint, taking pictures of the valley below. As my wife is looking through the camera viewfinder, she picks up on the woman in the distance. She is standing in the woods a little ways down the mountain toward the valley, watching us. As her final act, she walked up the mountainside and sat right beside us on a boulder that was beside the chairs. She says nothing. Just sits there. My wife has the brilliant idea of asking me to take one last picture of the scenery, and she gives me a little wink. I pick up on her idea right away, and I position myself so this woman is going to be in the picture. My wife wanted this lady's photo in the event something bad happens with her before we can leave the area. We took our final looks out at the beautiful scenery and headed to our camp for the night. We didn't see or hear from her again. Upon reflection, we agreed this woman had some serious mental health issues, obviously. She had zero social skills, and we did witness her attempt to make friends with those two girls that shafted her in a terrible way. That being said, she did things way beyond the realm of acceptable social awkwardness. There were moments I thought she would pull out a knife and kill us all where we stood. More than that, the stalking, the midnight screaming, and running off into the woods at night were terrifying to us, and I feel a story worthy of this channel. I do have the photo on a thumb drive somewhere. To anyone else, the picture just looks like a person is sitting in the shot. But to us, it's a reminder of our wild adventure and the start of our amazing marriage. To our honeymoon stalker. Let's not meet ever again.